There is a face you have seen before. Maybe you passed it in a crowd, or spotted it on a screen, or found it staring back at you in an old photograph. High cheekbones set against pale skin that seems almost too smooth, too white, like it was built for a different sun. Eyes that change color depending on the light, sometimes green, sometimes gray, sometimes a shade that does not have a name. Hair ranging from deep copper to black, so dark it carries a blue sheen. A jaw that tends toward strength. A stillness in the face that is somehow ancient. That is an Irish face. And it is not like any other face in Europe. Geneticists know it. Anthropologists know it. The bones in the ground know it. And when you start pulling at the threads of why, the story that unravels is far stranger, far older, and far more forbidden than anything you will read in a standard history book. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. The story of the Irish face is not a story about Ireland the nation. It goes back 40,000 years before Ireland existed as a concept. It goes back to ice and ocean, to migrations nobody recorded, to blood types that should not appear in Western Europe at the frequencies they do, to genetic signatures that match populations on the other side of the world with no known bridge between them. It goes back to a people who arrived at the edge of the Atlantic and stopped, not because they could not go further, but because the ocean told them this was where they were supposed to be. And what happened to them after that, locked on the outermost shore of the continent for millennia, produced something that the rest of Europe simply does not have. This is the real reason the Irish look different. And the answer is written in their bones, their blood, their genes, and in something older than any of those things. Something that was already there when the first human beings arrived on the island, waiting in the ground and the sea and the light. Let us start at the beginning. Not the beginning people think of when they think of Irish history. Not the Celts, not St. Patrick, not the Vikings, not any of the stories taught in schools. The real beginning. 40,000 years ago, when the last great ice age still had its hand over most of the northern world. At that point, there was no island called Ireland. There was a peninsula of ice, a tongue of frozen land extending out from the northwestern edge of a continent that was itself barely recognizable. Sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. What is now the Irish Sea did not exist. Britain and Ireland were not islands. They were a single landmass attached to continental Europe, and that landmass was at its western end a brutal, windswept, half-glaciated place where almost nothing lived. But things were moving. South of the ice, in pockets of survivable climate scattered across southern Europe, there were people. Small, mobile bands of anatomically modern humans who had arrived in Europe from the east roughly 45,000 years ago and were slowly, over generations, learning how to live in this cold and difficult world. They are called Cro-Magnons, which is simply an archaeological label. What they actually were was us. Full human beings with the same cognitive capacity we have now, the same capacity for language and art and complex social organization. They painted caves, they carved figurines, they made flutes from bird bone. They tracked animals across hundreds of miles of frozen terrain and survived winters that would kill a modern person within days. And they had a physical appearance that would, if you saw one walking toward you on a street today, look startlingly familiar. The skeletal evidence from this period, analyzed by physical anthropologists over the last century, shows a consistent body type in Western Europe. Tall by the standards of the time, broad through the shoulders, a particular skull shape with prominent brow ridges, strong jaw, high forehead, and the teeth. The teeth are the thing that keeps coming up in the literature, because Cro-Magnon teeth are unusual, large, well-developed, with a particular wear pattern that suggests a diet of processed plant foods alongside meat, a diet that required real jaw strength. These people were not going anywhere near Ireland for a very long time. The island was buried under ice, but they were accumulating on the southern and western margins of the continent in refugia, the climatically sheltered pockets where life was possible. The Iberian Peninsula was the biggest and most important of these refugia. The land that is now Spain and Portugal was warmer, wetter, more sheltered than the frozen plains to the north. And it was there, in that Iberian refugium, that the ancestors of the Irish were waiting for the ice to melt. This is the first piece of the puzzle, and it is crucial. The people who would eventually become the Irish are not descended primarily from Central European populations. They are not descended from the steppe. Their deep ancestry, the oldest layer of their DNA, points to Iberia, points to that Atlantic coastal refugium where a population spent thousands of years in relative isolation, developing specific physical characteristics, specific blood group frequencies, specific genetic signatures that they would carry with them when the ice finally retreated and they moved north along the Atlantic shore. The ice began melting around 15,000 years ago, not all at once but in pulses, retreating and advancing, opening corridors and closing them, flooding low-lying land as sea levels rose with the released meltwater. Ireland became habitable slowly. The first evidence of human presence on the island dates to around 12,500 years ago from a site called Alice and Gwendoline Cave in County Clare. A bare bone found there showed cut marks, unmistakable signs of human butchery. Someone was in Ireland 12,500 years ago, processing a brown bear, but those first arrivals did not stay, or did not leave a continuous genetic legacy that can be traced to modern Irish people. The real founding population, the one whose DNA is still clearly detectable in the Irish today, arrived later, after a cold snap called the Younger Dryas had ended and the climate had stabilized enough to support sustained settlement. They arrived around 11 to 10,000 years ago. They came from the Atlantic facade of Europe, and they came with the genetic signature of the Iberian refugium stamped into every cell of their bodies. These people are called Western hunter-gatherers, or WHG in the genetic literature. They are one of the three ancestral populations that, in various combinations, make up all modern Europeans. The other two are early European farmers, who arrived from Anatolia around 8,000 years ago, and steppe ancestry populations, who moved in from the Pontic-Caspian steppe around 5,000 years ago. Almost every European carries some mixture of all three, but the Irish carry the WHG component in higher proportions than almost any other population on the continent. Their ancestry is tilted dramatically toward that original Atlantic hunter-gatherer baseline in ways that other Europeans simply are not. Why does that matter for what people look like? Because the WHG population had specific physical characteristics that are now overrepresented in Ireland. They had dark skin by the standards of modern Europeans, because the skin-lightening mutations that make European skin pale had not yet reached their full penetration in Western populations. They had blue or green eyes at unusually high frequency, a combination that modern Europeans find striking and that other world populations find almost alien. They had a genetic predisposition toward dark or auburn hair that, combined with later mutations, produces the wide range of Irish hair colours from black to copper. They had a particular skull morphology that some physical anthropologists have described as distinctly archaic-looking compared to the more gracile faces produced by the mixing of WHG, farmer, and steppe ancestries that characterizes most of continental Europe. The Western hunter-gatherer face, in other words, is the Irish face, and Ireland has more of it than anywhere else because Ireland was, and largely remained, one of the most isolated places on the western edge of the continent. Now here is where the story gets interesting. Because isolation is not the only explanation. Isolation can preserve things, but it does not usually amplify them to the degree that Irish genetics shows amplification of certain traits. Something else is going on. And to understand it, you have to understand what happened when the farming revolution arrived in Ireland. The early European farmers came from Anatolia, from the region that is now Turkey, and they spread westward across Europe, beginning around 8,000 years ago. They brought agriculture, they brought domesticated animals, they brought pottery, they brought a way of organizing life around permanent settlements and stored food that was, in many ways, more productive than hunter-gathering. And wherever they went, they replaced the existing hunter-gatherer populations. Not always through violence, though there is evidence of that too, but through demographic pressure. Farmers can support more people per square kilometer than hunter-gatherers. More people means more children. More children means your genes spread faster. Within a few thousand years, the early European farmers had effectively replaced the genetic signal of WHG across most of continental Europe, leaving only traces. But Ireland was different. The farming transition in Ireland happened later than in continental Europe, and it happened in a way that preserved more of the WHG ancestry than almost anywhere else on the continent. There are several reasons for this. The island's geography made it harder to reach and harder to colonize in waves. The existing population, small but established, had deep familiarity with the landscape and its resources in ways that gave them survival advantages even against the demographic pressure of farming communities. And Ireland's ecology, its wetter climate, its different soil types, the particular mix of resources available on the Atlantic fringe, may have made purely agricultural strategies less immediately dominant than they were on the drier, more productive soils of Central Europe. The result is that when you sequence the ancient DNA from Neolithic Irish individuals, you find something surprising. The farming ancestry did arrive. Ireland's Neolithic is real, documented in the great megalithic monuments, the passage tombs of the Boyne Valley, the court cairns scattered across the north and west, the Neolithic village sites, like Said Fields in Mayo, where a vast system of field walls was preserved under bog. But the people who built these things, the Neolithic Irish, show a higher proportion of WHG ancestry than their contemporaries on the continent. Ireland was a place where the hunter-gatherer baseline was never fully displaced. It was diluted, but not erased. And then something extraordinary happened in the Bronze Age. Around 4,500 years ago, a new population began moving across Europe from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea that are now part of Russia and Ukraine. These are the people associated with the Yamnaya culture, and they brought with them horses, wheeled vehicles, bronze metallurgy, and a genetic package that included the ancestry of people who had been herding animals on the steppe for thousands of years. They swept across continental Europe with extraordinary speed, replacing or dominating existing populations to a degree that left the steppe genetic signal clearly visible in almost every modern European. In Britain, ancient DNA shows that steppe ancestry replaced a very large proportion of the farming population within just a few centuries. In Ireland, the same transition happened, but the Irish data shows something that keeps geneticists writing careful footnotes. The steppe ancestry arrived in Ireland and spread through the population. But it arrived into a population that already had an unusually high WHG component. And in the mixing that followed, the specific combination of high WHG plus steppe produced a genetic profile that is, in certain characteristics, notably different from what the same process produced in continental European populations where there was less WHG to start with. Think of it like mixing paint. If you start with a base that is already unusual and add the same new color that everyone else is adding, you get a different result than if you start from a more typical base. Ireland started from an unusual base. The WHG component was unusually strong. The result of the Bronze Age mixing is a genetic profile that sits in a distinct part of the European genetic landscape, close to the British, close to the coastal Atlantic populations, but identifiably its own thing. And this is where the physical traits start making more sense. The specific combination of WHG genes and steppe genes that characterizes Irish ancestry produces particular patterns in things like pigmentation, facial structure, and body proportions that are different from what you get with different mixture ratios. The high frequency of red and auburn hair in Ireland is not simply a Celtic thing. It is not something that arrived with the Celts. The evidence suggests it was already present in Ireland before the Celtic expansion. It traces back partly to the WHG ancestry, which carried the MC1R variants associated with red hair at higher frequencies than the farming populations from Anatolia. The amplification of those variants in the Irish population happened through a combination of the WHG starting point, the particular genetic drift that occurred during Ireland's relatively isolated demographic history, and possibly some element of selection. The blue and green eye frequencies in Ireland are among the highest in the world, higher than in most of continental Europe, higher than in Scandinavia. The genetics of eye color is complex, involving variants in genes like OCA2 and HERC2, but the broad picture is that the light eye variants were already present in the WHG population at high frequency, having possibly been selected for in low UV environments during the Ice Age refugia period. Ireland, on the Atlantic fringe, in an environment of mist and low light for much of the year, sustained and possibly intensified that selection pressure. But here is the thing that most discussions of Irish genetics do not adequately address. The physical distinctiveness of the Irish face is not just about pigmentation, it is something structural. The bones are different. Physical anthropologists who have worked with historical Irish skeletal collections have noted specific features that distinguish them from continental European populations. A tendency toward longer skulls, technically called dolichocephaly, that was more pronounced in ancient Irish populations and has not been completely erased in modern ones. A particular brow ridge morphology, a jaw that is wider relative to the overall face than in most continental European populations. These are not dramatic differences, they are subtle, but they are consistent, and they point to a skull shape that retains more of the WHG baseline than the more gracile, rounder faces that characterized populations where the Anatolian farmer ancestry was dominant for longer and in higher proportions. You cannot look at an Irish face and always pick it out from a crowd, but you can often pick it out, and what you are picking out is not a cultural marker or a learned expression or something about clothing. You are reading ancient genetics. You are seeing the Western hunter-gatherer face, modified by 4,000 years of Bronze Age and Iron Age and medieval admixture, but not erased, never fully erased. Now, we need to talk about something that the genetics papers tend to handle with careful scientific neutrality, but that is, if you sit with it for a moment, genuinely extraordinary. The blood. The Irish have blood type frequencies that are different from the rest of Europe. Not dramatically different, not so different that they are unambiguously separate, but different in ways that have been documented since blood typing became possible in the early 20th century, and that have never been satisfactorily explained by standard population history models. The biggest anomaly involves the Rh-negative blood type. Rh-negative blood is rare globally. Most humans are Rh positive. About 15% of people of European descent carry the Rh-negative variant. But across Europe, there is a clear gradient in Rh-negative frequency. It peaks in the Basque region of northern Spain and southern France, where rates approach 30 to 35%. It remains elevated in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, the Celtic Atlantic fringe. It drops as you move east across the continent. It is rare in Eastern Europe and Asia. It is very rare in Africa, and essentially absent in indigenous populations of the Americas and Australia. The Irish Rh-negative frequency is around 25%. That is significantly above the European average. It places the Irish alongside the Welsh, the Scots, the Bretons, and the Basques in a cluster of Atlantic populations with elevated Rh-negative rates. And that cluster, when you map it against the ancient DNA evidence, maps almost perfectly onto the populations with the highest WHG ancestry. This is not coincidence. The Rh-negative blood type, whatever its ultimate origin, is associated with the ancient Atlantic populations of Western Europe. It is part of the Western hunter-gatherer genetic package, or at minimum, it travelled with those populations and was amplified in their descendants on the Atlantic fringe through isolation and genetic drift. Ireland, as the westernmost populated landmass in the Atlantic zone, has retained this signature at high frequency. But the Rh blood group is not the only blood type anomaly in the Irish. The ABO blood group system also shows Irish-specific patterns. The frequency of blood type O is higher in Ireland than in most of continental Europe. Blood type O is associated with WHG ancestry and with Atlantic coastal populations generally. Blood type A, which increased across Europe with the spread of farming from Anatolia, is less common in Ireland than in most European populations. And blood type B, which arrived from the east with steppe migrations, is also less common in Ireland than in continental European populations who received heavier steppe input. What you are looking at, when you put all these blood type frequencies together, is a population whose immune system genetics reflect an unusually high proportion of pre-agricultural ancestry. The Neolithic and Bronze Age admixtures happened in Ireland. They left their mark. But the baseline was different, and the subsequent history of the island meant that the dilution of the original Atlantic hunter-gatherer signal proceeded more slowly than elsewhere. And then there is something that the conventional genetic narrative does not explain at all. Something that sits in the data like a stone in a river, diverting the current of easy explanation. When researchers began doing detailed population genetic analysis of modern Irish people and comparing them to other world populations, They found the expected connections to other Western Europeans. Those were not surprising. What was surprising were some of the secondary connections, weak but real genetic signals connecting the Irish, and particularly specific Western Irish subpopulations, to populations in unexpected places. There are ancient DNA studies showing that some Irish population clusters show weak but statistically significant similarity to ancient North African populations. Not modern North Africans, but ancient ones, specifically populations that inhabited the Maghreb in the pre-agricultural period and whose genetic legacy is largely invisible in modern populations because it was overlaid by later migrations from the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa. These ancient Maghrebi populations were themselves part of the broader Western Mediterranean hunter-gatherer complex. They may represent a southern branch of the same WHG ancestral pool that fed Ireland from the north. There are also, and this is the part that makes mainstream geneticists very careful with their language, subtle signals connecting the Irish to populations along the eastern coast of North America, specifically to certain Native American groups. These signals are weak. They do not appear in all studies. They are controversial. Some researchers attribute them to statistical artifacts, to the known fact that comparing large and diverse populations will always throw up spurious similarities. Others think they reflect something real about the deep history of Atlantic coastal populations before the continents were fully separated by rising post-glacial seas. The theory that has been proposed, not mainstream but not entirely fringe either, is that there was a pre-agricultural Atlantic coastal culture that extended along the shores of the ocean from what is now Morocco through Iberia and Ireland and Britain, and potentially further. A culture based on maritime resources, shellfish, and fish, and sea mammals, that was coherent and connected enough to maintain genetic exchange across distances that seem large but were, for people in boats, manageable, and that this Atlantic maritime culture, whatever its full extent, was the direct ancestor of the WHG population that colonized Ireland when the ice retreated. If this is true, then the Irish face is not just the oldest face in Western Europe. It is the face of a maritime civilization that existed before civilization was a concept, that stretched across an ocean, that was erased by 10,000 years of successive waves of farmers and herders from the east, but that survived in its purest form on the westernmost island, because the island was hard to reach, hard to colonize, and because something about its landscape made the old ways viable for longer than anywhere else. You cannot prove this. Not yet. The ancient DNA from Atlantic coastal sites is sparse because those sites are mostly underwater now, flooded by the post-glacial rise in sea levels. The settlements where that maritime culture lived are sitting under 100 meters of ocean water off the coasts of Ireland and Britain and France and Spain. We cannot excavate them. We can only infer their existence from the genetic echoes they left in the people who moved inland when the sea rose. But the echoes are there, and they are specifically Irish, in a way that they are not quite so specifically anything else. Now, we need to talk about the Celts, because any discussion of Irish distinctiveness has to deal with the dominant narrative about Celtic origins, and the dominant narrative is, it turns out, significantly wrong. The standard story, the one taught in schools and repeated in popular histories for most of the 20th century, goes like this. The Celts were a people from Central Europe, from around the Hallstatt and Latene archaeological cultures of Austria and Switzerland and the Upper Danube region, who spread across Europe in the Iron Age, bringing their language and their culture with them. They arrived in Britain and Ireland around 700 to 300 BCE and replaced or overlaid the existing populations, bringing Celtic language, Celtic art, Celtic mythology. The Irish became Celtic by this process. This story is appealing. It is clean. It fits a particular kind of nationalist mythology in which identity is something that arrived from outside and was adopted. And it is, in its specifics, almost certainly wrong for Ireland. The ancient DNA evidence has not found any significant arrival of Central European ancestry in Ireland coinciding with the spread of Celtic languages. The Bronze Age steppe ancestry individuals in Ireland do not look like Hallstatt or Latene people. The Iron Age genetic record from Ireland shows continuity with the Bronze Age population, not a new wave of continental migrants, which raises an obvious and deeply uncomfortable question for the standard model. If the Celtic language did not arrive in Ireland with a large migrating population from Central Europe, How did it get there? This is one of the most active debates in the field right now, and there is no consensus answer. But the leading alternative hypothesis is something called the Atlantic Celtic hypothesis. The idea that Celtic languages did not originate in Central Europe and spread westward, but instead originated on the Atlantic facade of Europe, possibly in Iberia, possibly in the maritime zone that ran from Iberia through France and Britain and Ireland, and spread north and east from there. This would mean that Celtic language is not something the Irish received from the outside. It is something that developed in the Atlantic coastal zone, of which Ireland is the northernmost and most isolated part. Celtic language would be native to the Atlantic coast. It would have been there before the Central European cultures that archaeologists label as Hallstatt and Latene. The Central European Celts would be, on this model, a later and secondary development, people who adopted a language and culture that had originated further west. If the Atlantic Celtic hypothesis is correct, the implications for Irish identity are profound. It means the Irish have not been speaking a borrowed language for 2,500 years. They have been speaking, with modifications and evolution, a language whose deep roots are in the Atlantic coastal population that has been in Western Europe since before the farming transition. The language is as old as the people. The people are as old as the island's habitation. This is contested. There are linguists who strongly prefer the Central European origin model. There are archaeologists who think the Atlantic Celtic hypothesis does not explain the Latène material culture distribution adequately. The debate is real and ongoing. But the genetic evidence tilts toward the Atlantic hypothesis, because the genetics say there was no mass migration from Central Europe to Ireland in the Iron Age, and if there was no migration, the language had to come from somewhere closer. Let us step back from the genetics for a moment and talk about the physical environment of Ireland itself, because the landscape has been shaping the people as much as the people have been shaping the landscape. Ireland is not simply a Western European island. It is specifically an Atlantic island. Its climate is determined by the Atlantic Ocean, which moderates temperatures dramatically, but also delivers enormous quantities of moisture. The western parts of the island receive some of the highest rainfall in Europe. County Mayo, County Galway, County Kerry, the western seaboard where the WHG ancestry is most concentrated in modern populations, are places of almost constant moisture, mist, rain, cloud. The sky is rarely clear for long. The light, when the sun does break through, is filtered through layers of water vapor and is extraordinarily soft, casting no harsh shadows, illuminating landscapes with a quality that is unlike the light of inland Europe. For a population that has lived in this light for 12,000 years, there are consequences. Pale skin is not just a cosmetic difference, it is an adaptation to low UV environments. The Irish skin, which burns almost universally and tans with difficulty, is built for a sky that delivers minimal UV radiation through most of the year. It is maximally efficient at vitamin D synthesis from the weak sunlight available. The skin lightening alleles that are common in the Irish population, particularly variants in the SLC24A5 and SLC45A2 genes, are present at very high frequency, having been selected for over thousands of years of life under an Atlantic sky. But the skin color of modern Irish people is not simply about those skin-lightening alleles. It is also about what those alleles are layered on top of. The WHG population had, it appears, dark skin combined with light eyes, a combination that modern Europeans find startling because they associate light eyes with pale skin. The genetic evidence from WHG individuals, including Cheddarman in Britain, whose DNA was sequenced in 2018, shows that dark skin and blue eyes coexisted in these ancient Atlantic populations for thousands of years. As skin-lightening mutations spread, they acted on a genetic background that already had the light eye variants. The result, in Ireland, where the WHG background is deeper and the selection pressure for pale skin was sustained for longer, is skin that is extremely pale, combined with eyes that are often extremely light. A combination of maximum effect because both sets of traits are running at near maximum frequency. And the hair. The red hair of Ireland is possibly the most written about physical feature associated with the island and its people. It has generated legends, it has been used to mock and to celebrate. It has been the subject of more bad jokes than almost any other human physical characteristic. And it is, in genetic terms, a mystery that has not been fully resolved. The MC1R gene, which controls production of melanin pigmentation in hair and skin, has dozens of variants. The variants that produce red hair are specific loss-of-function mutations that shift production from dark eumelanin to red-yellow pheomelanin. These variants, particularly the ones labeled R151C, R160W, and D294H in the scientific literature, occur at exceptionally high frequency in Ireland. Roughly 10 to 13% of the Irish population has red hair, and the carrier frequency for MC1R red hair variants is much higher than that, approaching 40 to 50% in some population samples. This is not a Celtic thing. The genetics are clear on this. The MC1R variants associated with red hair appear to have been in the Atlantic population before the Bronze Age, before the Iron Age, before any Celtic language spread through the region. The ancient DNA from Irish Mesolithic and Neolithic individuals shows MC1R variants. Red hair was present in the pre-farming population of Ireland. It was there from the beginning, but 10 to 13% is a puzzlingly high frequency for a trait that has no obvious selective advantage in modern humans and potentially some selective disadvantages, including increased skin cancer risk and altered pain sensitivity. Why did it persist at such high frequency? Why did selection not remove it? There are a few possible explanations. One is founder effect and genetic drift in small, isolated populations. When the island was colonized by a small founding group from the Iberian refugium, if that group happened to carry MC1R variants at higher frequency than the broader continental population, those variants would have been overrepresented in Irish descendants simply by chance, and isolation would have maintained that overrepresentation. There is also the possibility of sexual selection. Some researchers have proposed that red hair was advantageous in mate choice in the Atlantic population, perhaps as a marker of group membership, perhaps for reasons that cannot now be determined from the archaeological record. And there is the more speculative possibility that MC1R variants confer some physiological advantage in Atlantic coastal environments that is not immediately obvious. The truth is probably a combination of all of these. Founder effect established red hair at elevated frequency in the Irish population. Isolation maintained it. The particular demographic history of Ireland, its late adoption of farming, its high retention of WHG ancestry, its geographic isolation, its smaller effective population size that made genetic drift more powerful, all amplified a signal that was already present in the founding population. Whatever the explanation, the result is a population where red hair is common enough to be considered a defining characteristic, to be associated with the place in a way that no other hair color is associated with any other country. You cannot say German people have brown hair, or French people have dark hair, and have that feel specifically true. But you can say Irish people have red hair and have it feel like you have said something real. Because something real is there, in the genetics, in the ancient DNA, in the frequencies that set Ireland apart from its European neighbours. Now let us talk about the Neolithic. Because the Neolithic Irish left evidence that transforms everything we think we understand about what this population was capable of before the Celts, before the Romans, before any of the historical civilizations that are supposed to have brought culture to the Atlantic fringe. The passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in County Meath are the most famous monuments of Neolithic Ireland. Newgrange, Knowth, Dowth, and the dozens of smaller monuments that cluster around them form one of the most impressive concentrations of prehistoric architecture in the world. And they are, in ways that most visitors do not fully appreciate, astronomically sophisticated. Newgrange was built approximately 5,200 years ago. That makes it older than Stonehenge by about 5 centuries, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza by about 6 centuries. The monument is a large circular mound, roughly 80 meters in diameter and 12 meters high, containing an internal chamber reached by a 19-meter-long passage. The whole structure contains an estimated 200,000 tons of material. It was built by a farming population without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without any technology that modern engineers would recognize as adequate to the task. But the engineering achievement is not what makes Newgrange extraordinary. The extraordinary thing is the roof box. Above the entrance to the passage, the builders constructed a small opening in the stonework, carefully angled so that on the winter solstice, and only on the winter solstice, The rising sun shines directly through the roof box and down the full length of the 19-meter passage to illuminate the back wall of the inner chamber. The beam of light lasts approximately 17 minutes. Then the angle changes and the chamber goes dark again until the following year. This required the builders to know the winter solstice, to know where the sun would rise on that specific morning, to know the angle of that sunrise precisely enough to cut a stone slit that would catch exactly that beam and direct it exactly down that passage to exactly that spot on the back wall, and to execute that knowledge in stone without instruments we would recognize 5,200 years ago. The archaeoastronomers who have studied Newgrange are in full agreement that the roof box alignment is intentional and precise. They are less in agreement about what it means. The obvious answer is ritual, that it marked the turning of the year and had religious significance, that people gathered at the monument on the solstice morning to watch the light return. But the precision required is beyond what is necessary for simple ritual marking. You do not need to direct a beam to within a degree of arc to mark the winter solstice. You can mark the winter solstice with a standing stone and see where its shadow falls. The precision at Newgrange suggests an interest in the phenomenon itself, in the mechanics of it, in the relationship between the sun and the Earth's orbit, that goes beyond what any simple ritual explanation requires. There are people who have suggested, carefully and with appropriate academic qualifications, that the builders of Newgrange had a sophisticated observational astronomy, and that what they encoded in the monument is the product of decades or centuries of careful observation of the solar cycle. This would require maintaining records, or at minimum, a precise oral tradition across multiple generations of observers. It would require a level of intellectual organization that the standard narrative about Neolithic people does not usually allow for. And Newgrange is not alone. Noth, the largest monument in the Boyne complex, has two passages aligned to the spring and autumn equinoxes. The entrance curbstone at Newgrange is decorated with a complex spiral pattern that some researchers believe encodes a calendar based on the solar year. The entire Boyne complex, when viewed from above, has a spatial organization that some archaeoastronomers think reflects knowledge of both the solar and lunar cycles and their relationship. Who built these things? The ancient DNA is beginning to give us answers. Analysis of human remains from Neolithic Irish monuments, including individuals buried within the Great Tombs, shows a population with more WHG ancestry than their continental European counterparts, a farming population that had absorbed more of the local hunter-gatherer baseline than their cousins in Britain or France. They were not the pure Anatolian farmer genome. They were a hybrid, and the Irish hunter-gatherer contribution to that hybrid was substantial. They also show something else, something that caused considerable controversy when the paper was published. One of the individuals sequenced from Newgrange was male. He carried a genetic signature, suggesting first-degree relatives had mated with each other. In other words, the evidence suggests a degree of inbreeding that, in modern contexts, is associated with ruling dynasties and the deliberate concentration of genetic lineages for purposes of social control. The Irish Neolithic, the same people who built the most precisely aligned astronomical monument in Western Europe, apparently had a stratified social structure in which a ruling elite maintained its status through controlled reproduction. This is not supposed to exist in Neolithic farming communities. This is supposed to be Bronze Age, Iron Age, historical civilization behavior. But here it is, 5,000 years ago, in the people who built Newgrange. The mythology knew about this long before the archaeology confirmed it. The Great Passage tombs were not remembered as mere tombs in Irish tradition. They were remembered as the Sids, the otherworldly mounds, the residences of the Tuatha De Danann, the divine race who preceded the historical Irish in mythology. The Tuatha De Danann were not remembered as ghosts or as simple dead ancestors. They were remembered as beings of power, of knowledge, of specifically astronomical and magical knowledge, who lived within the hills, who built great things, who knew secrets about the structure of the year and the universe that ordinary humans did not have access to. This mythological memory, preserved through 2,000 years of oral tradition before it was written down in medieval manuscripts, is a memory of something that actually happened, not the supernatural elements, not the magic, but the core fact that there was a powerful, knowledgeable, socially stratified population on this island who built monuments of extraordinary sophistication and who were eventually displaced or absorbed by newcomers, the people who brought Bronze Age technology. The mythology remembers the end of the Neolithic and the beginning of the Bronze Age. It frames it as the defeat of one divine race by another. What it is actually recording is the genetic and cultural transition that the ancient DNA evidence is now revealing. And what came in the Bronze Age is equally remarkable, because Ireland's Bronze Age is not just notable for its genetics, it is notable for the extraordinary quantity and quality of the metalwork produced during this period. Irish Bronze Age goldwork, in particular, is among the finest in Europe. Lunulae, crescent-shaped sheet gold collars, were produced in Ireland in such quantities that they appear across Britain and continental Europe, clearly Irish in manufacture, clearly exported as prestige objects to Bronze Age elites throughout the Atlantic zone. The technology required to produce them, hammering gold into sheets of extraordinary thinness and uniform consistency without the aid of machines, represents a level of metallurgical skill that modern craftspeople struggle to replicate. Where did that skill come from? Ireland had copper and gold. The mines at Ross Island in County Kerry are among the oldest known copper mines in northwest Europe, in operation from around 4,400 years ago. The island had the raw materials, but the skill was something developed, refined, transmitted across generations of specialists whose knowledge was kept within lineages and guilds, whose techniques were their most valuable possession. This is consistent with a broader pattern in Irish prehistory. The island's geographic isolation, which kept it from being easily colonized, also kept it from being easily disrupted. Knowledge systems, craft traditions, astronomical knowledge, ritual knowledge, genetic lineages could all persist in Ireland for longer than in more accessible parts of Europe, because each new wave of newcomers had to negotiate with what was already there rather than simply replacing it. Ireland absorbed. It did not simply receive. The Celts, or rather the people who brought Celtic language and Iron Age culture to Ireland, whoever they actually were, encountered a population that had been on the island for 6,000 years. A population with its own astronomical knowledge, its own metallurgical tradition, its own social structures, its own mythology, its own genetic distinctiveness. They did not replace that, they merged with it. And the result, over the centuries of the Iron Age and into the historical period, was a culture that was Celtic in language and art, but Atlantic in its bones and blood, and in the deepest layers of what it remembered about itself. Now we need to go deeper into something that the standard accounts of Irish history, whether they are about genetics or culture or mythology, almost never directly address. The question of whether the Irish face, and the blood and genes behind it, preserve something that was lost everywhere else, not just in Europe, but possibly anywhere. Consider what happened to the WHG population on the continent of Europe. The early European farmers arrived from Anatolia around 8,000 years ago, and within 3,000 to 4,000 years had largely replaced the hunter-gatherer genetic signal across most of the continent. The replacement was not total, but it was dramatic. In Central Europe, the WHG ancestry drops to roughly 20 to 30% in early farming populations. In Iberia, the process was slower but still proceeded. Then the steppe migrations of the Bronze Age added another layer, further diluting the WHG signal in most populations. By the time you get to modern continental Europeans, the WHG ancestry is present, but it is minority. Most modern continental Europeans are majority Anatolian farmer and steppe ancestry combined. The original hunter-gatherer genome is visible in the data, but it is not dominant. The face of the Cro-Magnon, the physical appearance of the people who painted the caves of Chauvet and Lascaux, is receding from the European population over historical time. Except in Ireland, and to a lesser extent in Scotland and Wales and Western Britain, the Atlantic fringe preserved it. The island preserved it best of all. What this means is that when you look at an Irish face, you are seeing something that has been almost lost. You are seeing the physical appearance of the people who were the original inhabitants of Western Europe, the hunter-gatherers who came from the Iberian refugium when the ice retreated, who colonized a landscape that is now the westernmost edge of the Old World, and who left their genetic signature in the people of that island so strongly that it is still visible, still detectable, still surprising to geneticists who expect European populations to look more similar to each other than they do. This is not myth, This is genetics. This is ancient DNA. This is the discipline that has transformed our understanding of European prehistory in the last 15 years more dramatically than the previous century of archaeology. And what it is telling us, if you listen to what it actually says rather than the simplified popular versions, is that the Irish are different because they are old. Specifically, old in a particular way. They are the population on the European continent that has retained the highest proportion of its pre-farming, pre-steppe, prehistorical ancestry. The farmers came to Ireland late. The steppe people came to Ireland and mixed with a population that had more hunter-gatherer ancestry than their counterparts elsewhere. The subsequent historical periods, the Iron Age, the Viking Age, the Norman Conquest, all added their contributions, but they added them to a base that was already unusual, that was already old in a specific way, and that was large enough and coherent enough to absorb those contributions without losing its fundamental character. But there is another layer to this story, one that the genetics alone does not fully explain, one that requires paying attention to what the Irish preserved in their minds rather than just in their genes. Ireland has the oldest vernacular literature in Western Europe. Not in Latin, the language of the Church, but in Irish, the vernacular language of the people. The oldest Irish manuscripts date from the 6th and 7th centuries CE, but they record traditions, genealogies, mythologies, and legal systems that are demonstrably much older. The law tracts of early medieval Ireland encode social and economic arrangements that reflect a pastoral, cattle-based economy going back to the Bronze Age and possibly earlier. The mythological cycles preserve stories whose internal structure, whose archetypes and narrative patterns match what folklorists and comparative mythologists recognize as Indo-European material of the greatest antiquity. But the Irish mythological tradition is not simply a local variant of a common European stock. It has specific elements that are unique. The Tuatha De Danann, the divine race, are not like the gods of Greece or Rome or Scandinavia. They are earthier, stranger, more closely tied to specific landscapes. They live in the hills and under the sea. They are associated with specific mountains, specific rivers, specific springs, and crucially, they do not leave. They go underground. They persist. The Irish mythology does not describe a pantheon that exists in a remote heaven, separate from the human world. It describes a divine world that is immediately adjacent to the human world, accessible through specific physical places, present in the landscape in ways that make the landscape itself sacred. This cosmological structure, the sacred landscape, the thin places where the other world bleeds through into the mundane world, is one of the most distinctive features of Irish spiritual culture. And it is not, despite what some popular writers suggest, simply a Celtic inheritance. It is something older. It resonates with what we can reconstruct about the spiritual world of hunter-gatherer societies globally, societies in which the landscape is alive, in which every significant geographical feature is inhabited by power, in which the boundary between the human and the other than human is permeable. The Irish landscape tradition, the Dinshentures, the law of high places, is a massive medieval text recording the mythological associations of hundreds of specific geographical locations in Ireland. Every significant mountain, river, lake, and plain has a story. The story explains its name, usually by reference to something that happened there involving supernatural beings. But underneath the mythology, the Dinshentures is a memory system. It is a way of encoding knowledge about the landscape in narrative form, in a format that can be transmitted orally across hundreds of generations. Hunter-gatherer societies do this. This is a hunter-gatherer technology applied to a farming and pastoral landscape. The Irish who composed and transmitted the Dinshentures were not hunter-gatherers, but they were working in a tradition of landscape memory that goes back, almost certainly, to the people who first walked this island 12,000 years ago, reading the terrain for food, for water, for shelter, for safety, and encoding what they found in stories tied to specific places. This is the face that Ireland shows to the world, not just the physical face, the pale skin and blue-green eyes and auburn hair, but the cultural face, a culture that is, at its roots, older than the historical period by a very long margin, a culture that retained more of the pre-agricultural world than most of Europe managed to keep, a culture that adapted and absorbed and survived, and continued to look out from that westernmost edge of the Old World with eyes that carry the light of the Atlantic inside them. Now, let us talk about what happened to that genetic distinctiveness when Ireland's history turned violent, because the history did turn violent, repeatedly. And the violence had consequences for the Irish genome that are not often discussed in the context of physical distinctiveness. The Viking Age brought Scandinavians to Ireland from the late 8th century onwards. They raided, they settled. They founded Dublin and Waterford and Limerick and Cork, all the major Irish cities that exist today. And they intermarried with the existing population to a degree that was, in hindsight, quite substantial. The genetic signature of Norse ancestry is detectable in the modern Irish population, particularly in the eastern coastal areas closest to the Viking settlements. It is not dominant, it is not the defining characteristic, but it is there. What did the Norse add to the Irish face? The Norse were themselves a population with relatively high WHG ancestry, combined with steppe ancestry and relatively little Anatolian farmer ancestry. Their physical characteristics, the pale skin, the light eyes, the light hair that is typically blonde or reddish blonde rather than dark, overlapped significantly with what was already present in Ireland. The Norse contribution, where it occurred, would have shifted Irish frequencies slightly toward more blonde or light brown hair and away from the darkest shades of auburn, but it would not have dramatically altered the overall picture because the Norse were operating on a substrate that already shared many of their characteristics. The Norman conquest of the 12th century brought a different kind of input. The Normans were of Norse origin but had spent 2 centuries in northern France, adopting French language and culture and mixing with the local Frankish and Gaulish population. They were more continental in their genetics, slightly higher in Anatolian farmer ancestry than the Norse, and their physical characteristics reflected that mixture. The Norman families who settled in Ireland and became, as the famous phrase has it, more Irish than the Irish themselves, added a small continental admixture to the Irish genetic pool, more pronounced in the areas of densest Norman settlement, particularly the southeast. But none of these historical migrations altered the fundamental character of the Irish genome sufficiently to eliminate the WHG-heavy baseline. The Irish absorbed. They always absorbed. The Normans who came to conquer adopted Irish language within a few generations. Their descendants became indistinguishable from the Irish, in cultural terms. In genetic terms, they left a trace, but a trace absorbed into a background that was already more WHG-rich than anywhere else in Europe. The most significant genetic event in Irish history, far more significant than any migration or conquest in terms of its demographic impact, was the Great Famine of the 1840s. Between 1845 and 1852, a catastrophic failure of the potato crop, combined with British government policies that were, at minimum, indifferent to Irish suffering, produced a disaster of extraordinary scale. The Irish population, which had reached approximately 8 million by 1841, lost a quarter to death and another quarter to emigration within a decade. The population of Ireland today is still smaller than it was before the famine, and the famine was not demographically neutral. It killed and displaced preferentially. The poorest communities, the most rural communities, the communities in the west and southwest, where the WHG genetic signature is most concentrated, suffered the worst mortality and the highest emigration rates. The counties of Mayo, Galway, Roscommon, Clare, the heartland of Western Ireland, lost population at catastrophic rates. In some areas, the population fell by more than half. What does this mean for the genetics? It means that a severe demographic bottleneck was applied to the Western Irish population in the mid-19th century. A bottleneck that killed or displaced the people most closely associated with the ancient Atlantic genetic signature. The Irish who survived in Ireland and the Irish who emigrated to America and Australia and Britain carried a slightly different genetic profile than the pre-famine Irish population because the famine selected, with terrible efficiency, against the most isolated and traditional communities. The demographic consequences are still visible. The west of Ireland is sparsely populated in ways that have no environmental explanation. The land can support more people than it currently does. It is empty because the famine emptied it, and the emigration that began in the famine continued for a century and a half afterward. Modern population genetics shows that the genetic diversity of Western Irish communities is lower than expected, consistent with the bottleneck that the famine imposed. And the diaspora. The Irish diaspora is enormous, the largest per capita emigrant stream of any European nation in the 19th and 20th centuries. There are more people of Irish descent outside Ireland than in it. The United States alone has 30 to 40 million people who identify as Irish American. Australia, Canada, Britain all have substantial Irish-descended populations. What the diaspora did to Irish genetics is complex. The emigrant populations were diverse. They came from different parts of Ireland, carried different proportions of the various ancestral components. They married into the populations of their destination countries, and their children married further, diluting the specifically Irish genetic signal within a generation or two. The Irish American, who is 4 generations removed from immigration, carries roughly a quarter of Irish ancestry combined with English, German, Italian, Polish, and whatever else the intervening generations contributed. But the specifically Irish characteristics, where they appear in diaspora populations, tend to appear in concentrated form rather than diluted form because the mechanisms of their genetics make them behave that way. Red hair appears in diaspora populations at frequencies related to the number of MC1R variant copies inherited, and those copies are either present or not present in a relatively binary way. Pale skin, similarly, is not a trait that averages out to medium brown in mixed populations. It tends to express itself strongly when the relevant alleles are present. The Irish face, when it appears in diaspora populations, is often striking precisely because it appears in an unexpected context. An Irish-looking face in Buenos Aires or in New Zealand, pale and possibly red-haired, stands out against the surrounding population in a way it would not stand out in Dublin. Now, let us consider something that sits at the boundary between genetics and something harder to define. The question of whether the Irish physical distinctiveness corresponds to any other kind of distinctiveness. Whether there is something about the biology that connects to something about the psychology or the cognition or the way Irish people interact with the world. This is territory where caution is absolutely required, because the history of linking physical characteristics to psychological or cognitive traits is a history of catastrophic misuse, of racism and eugenics, and scientific fraud, dressed up in respectable language. The Irish themselves were on the receiving end of this. In the 19th century, when British ethnographers and anthropologists used skull measurements and blood type theories and pseudo-Darwinian frameworks to argue that the Irish were racially inferior, closer to the apes, less evolved than the Anglo-Saxon population that was supposedly their natural superior. This history is real, and it is recent enough to be within living memory of grandparents and great-grandparents. So, any claim that Irish genetics connects to Irish psychology needs to be made with extraordinary care, with explicit acknowledgement that environment and culture explain most of the psychological characteristics we associate with any population, and with clear rejection of any hierarchical framing that implies some genetic endowments are superior to others. With all of that said, there are some things worth noting that are in the realm of science rather than speculation. The Irish population shows elevated frequencies of certain variants in genes involved in neurotransmitter, metabolism, and regulation. Some researchers have suggested that Irish populations may have elevated rates of variants associated with sensitivity to environmental stress, higher baseline reactivity to social stimuli, and intense emotional responsiveness. These are traits that evolutionary psychologists link to high-investment social environments, environments where reading subtle social cues accurately is critically important to survival and reproduction. This might not be a coincidence in a population that spent millennia in small, isolated communities where social cohesion was the primary survival technology. In a population where there were no large cities, no large armies, no state apparatus, where everything depended on the quality of relationships within a small group, the ability to read people, to sense emotional states, to respond with intensity to social signals, would have been at an adaptive premium. If those traits have any heritable component, even a partial one, they might have been maintained at higher frequency in the Irish population than in populations where large-scale social organization offered alternatives to intense interpersonal relationship as a survival strategy. There is also the WHG population to consider. These were hunter-gatherers, And there is a well-documented literature on psychological characteristics that tend to be overrepresented in hunter-gatherer societies compared to agricultural ones. Characteristics like novelty-seeking, risk tolerance, intense present focus, a strong orientation toward immediate social reciprocity. The WHG baseline that the Irish have retained in higher proportions than other Europeans might be bringing with it some faint echo of hunter-gatherer psychology, amplified by 10,000 years in a small island on the edge of an ocean, where those characteristics remained adaptive. This is speculative. The genetics of psychology is enormously complex, and the science is preliminary. But it is worth noting that the characteristics associated in popular discussion with the Irish, the intensity, the storytelling, the humour that operates precisely at the boundary of pain, the relationship to melancholy that is somehow also a kind of joy, the Celtic twilight that writers and musicians and poets have been trying to describe for 2 centuries, might have a deeper root than culture alone can account for. Culture does not exist in a vacuum, it grows from a people, and a people is, in part, what their genetics have made them. The Irish language itself is evidence of something worth paying attention to. Irish is a Celtic language, but Celtic languages share a structural characteristic that distinguishes them from almost all other Indo-European languages. Verb initial sentence order. In Irish, the verb comes first in almost every sentence. Not the subject, not the object, the verb. The action comes before the actor. This is extraordinarily rare among the world's languages. Most languages lead with the subject. Irish leads with what is happening. Linguists have proposed various explanations for this, and the debate about Celtic syntax is ongoing. But some researchers have suggested that verb initial order may reflect a particular cognitive orientation toward events and processes, rather than toward agents and objects. A language in which you describe what is happening before you describe who is doing it creates a particular relationship between speakers and the world, one in which events have a kind of ontological priority over the entities involved in them. The world is, first of all, a place where things happen. Who is doing them is a secondary consideration. Whether this linguistic structure reflects something about the cognitive predispositions of the people who developed it, or whether it simply happened by linguistic accident, is impossible to say. But it is one more piece of evidence that the Irish relationship to the world, encoded in their language as in their genetics and their mythology, is not quite like anyone else's. Let us move to something concrete and documented, the distribution of Irish physical characteristics across the island itself. The west of Ireland is different from the east. This is a generalization, and like all generalizations about human populations, it has many exceptions. But the pattern is real, and it has been documented by physical anthropologists and geneticists. The WHG ancestry is more concentrated in the west. The populations that show the highest Rh negative frequencies, the highest rates of red hair, the highest concentrations of the specific skin and eye pigmentation combinations that we have been discussing, tend to be found in Connacht, in Western Munster, in Donegal. These are the areas that were most isolated, most remote from the historical centres of power and migration, most subject to the demographic devastation of the famine. The east of Ireland, Dublin and its hinterland, the south and east coast, the areas of Viking and Norman settlement, shows more of the continental European influence. The genetics of Dubliners is measurably different from the genetics of people from Connaught. Not dramatically, but measurably. The east tilts slightly more toward Anatolian farmer and steppe ancestry. The west tilts more toward WHG, and the west is where the Irish language survived longest, where it is still spoken, in the Gaeltacht communities of Galway and Donegal and Kerry, where the oldest traditions persisted, the folklore, the seasonal customs, the dances, the music. The language and the genetics and the cultural traditions cluster together in the most isolated parts of the island, in the places that were hardest for the various waves of outsiders to penetrate. This is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. The most isolated communities preserved the most ancient layers, and the most ancient layers are the ones that connect to the prehistorical origins of the population, to the WHG baseline, to the Iberian refugium, to the Atlantic maritime culture that preceded everything else. There is one more piece of this story that deserves careful attention. The question of why Ireland's physical distinctiveness is so consistently noticed, so consistently commented upon, so consistently treated as something special even by people who have no knowledge of the genetics behind it. People notice the Irish face. Not everyone, not always, but often enough that the observation is a cliché. Travel writers have commented on it for centuries. Novelists have described it. Artists have painted it. The pre-Raphaelites found it magnetic, used Irish models extensively, were drawn to something in the specific combination of characteristics that struck them as simultaneously ancient and beautiful. John Everett Millais, who used Irish models for several of his most famous paintings, described his models as having faces that seemed to come from another time. He was not wrong, he just did not know what time it was. The face that strikes observers as ancient is ancient. It is the Western hunter-gatherer face, modified by 6,000 years of agricultural and Bronze Age admixture, but not transformed by it. It is the face of people who lived on the Atlantic shore before the Mediterranean world existed as a civilizational concept. Before Rome, before Greece, before Egypt, before the wheel and writing and bronze, and it is still there. Still looking out of the faces of people in Galway and Kerry and Donegal and Tyrone, still visible in the diaspora communities of Boston and Chicago and Melbourne and London, still carrying, in its pale skin and its light eyes and its dark or red hair, the genetic signature of the most ancient layer of European humanity that survived anywhere in a recognizable form. The Irish look different from every other European, not because they are better or worse or superior or inferior, not because of mythology or legend or national pride, but because of geography and demography and the cold logic of population genetics operating over 12,000 years of island history. They are old, specifically old. Old in a way that the rest of Europe, overwritten by successive waves of farmers and herders and conquerors, could not manage to remain. The Western hunter-gatherers who walked north from Iberia when the ice retreated, who crossed to the island that would become Ireland, who looked out from its western cliffs at an ocean that extended to the edge of the known world, those people are not gone. Their descendants are still there. Their faces are still the faces of Ireland. Their blood is still in the veins of the people who stand on those same cliffs today and look out at the same water. That is the real reason the Irish look different. Not myth, not magic. The deep past, preserved by an island at the end of the world, speaking through the faces of the people who live there still. The archaeology has been telling this story for decades, in the bones and the monuments and the metalwork. The genetics is now telling it in the DNA, pulling it out of the ancient remains and the modern populations and building, fragment by fragment, a picture of what happened on that island over 12,000 years. And the story it tells is not a simple one. It is not a story about purity or about a single people with a single origin. It is a story about layers, about accumulation, about a specific geography in a specific location at a specific edge of a continent that created the conditions for something remarkable to survive. The Iberian hunter-gatherers who founded the Irish genetic baseline are long dead. Their bones are dust. Their language, whatever it was, is gone. Their names are gone, but their faces are still walking around the planet. And the reason that is true, the reason a population in the most remote corner of the Western world managed to hold on to 12,000 years of genetic continuity while the rest of Europe was repeatedly overwritten, is one of the most extraordinary stories in human prehistory. It is a story about an island, about weather and geography and isolation, about a population that was not technologically advanced in the ways that usually confer historical advantage, but that was located somewhere so hard to reach, so difficult to colonize completely, so wet and cold and peculiar in its ecology, that the forces that erased hunter-gatherer ancestry across the rest of Europe simply could not complete their work. The farmers came to Ireland. They left their mark. The steppe people came. They left their mark. The Celts, whoever they were, came or evolved in place. They left their mark. The Vikings came and left their mark. The Normans came and left their mark. The English came and left, centuries later, a very large mark indeed. But underneath all of those marks, visible still in the pigmentation genetics and the blood group frequencies and the skull morphology and the WHG ancestry proportion, the original population is still there. That is what you are seeing when you see an Irish face. All of that, 12,000 years of it, compressed into the particular angle of a cheekbone, the particular shade of an eye, the particular quality of a skin that was built for an Atlantic sky. It is there if you know how to look, and now you do. If this journey through 12,000 years of hidden history helped you understand something new about who we are and where we came from, you can tap the like button. It tells the algorithm to show more stories like this to people who might need them. You can subscribe so that the next exploration through forgotten time finds you. And if you feel moved to leave a comment, I would genuinely love to know where in the world you are right now, what landscape is outside your window, what sky is above you, while these ancient faces look back at you across the millennia. The people whose bones are now part of the Irish earth left nothing written, but they left everything else. The faces of their descendants are still here, still looking west at the water. And tonight, you looked back. That matters more than you might think. There is a moment in the study of Irish genetics where the numbers stop being numbers and become something else entirely, where the percentages of ancestry and the allele frequencies and the ancient DNA sequences stop being data points and start being people. Real people who walked a real island, who breathed the particular damp air of the Atlantic fringe, who looked out at the same mountains and bogs and grey-green sea that are still there today. That moment usually comes when you look at the specific geographical distribution of WHG ancestry across Ireland and realize that the areas of highest concentration correspond almost perfectly to the areas where the famine hit hardest. The areas where the most ancient layer of the Irish genome was concentrated are the areas that lost the most people in the most catastrophic demographic event in modern European history. There is something in that correspondence that is not comfortable to sit with. Something that suggests the forces of history, the hunger and the emigration and the death, operated with a terrible specificity on the most ancient population in Western Europe. The Connaught of today, the counties of the West, Mayo and Galway and Roscommon and Sligo, are beautiful and sparsely populated. Their emptiness is not natural. The landscape is not too harsh or too unproductive to support dense settlement. The Saïd Fields in Mayo, one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in Europe, demonstrate that the Neolithic Irish were farming this landscape successfully 5,500 years ago, building field systems of extraordinary extent that required thousands of people working cooperatively over generations. The emptiness of Western Ireland today is the emptiness left by the famine and a century of emigration that followed it. And what left with the emigrants was not only people but genetic information. The WHG signal that characterizes Western Irish populations, the elevated Rh negative rates, the high MC1R variant frequencies, the specific combination of physical characteristics that makes the Western Irish face distinctively ancient in appearance, much of that signal is now distributed across the world in the bodies of people who do not live in Ireland. It is in Boston and New York and Chicago. It is in Melbourne and Sydney. It is in Buenos Aires and Liverpool. The diaspora did not take Ireland away from those people, because what they carried was not just culture, it was genetics. And genetics follows the people wherever they go. But something specific happened in the diaspora, something that the genetics documents, even if the history books usually treat it as a cultural phenomenon rather than a biological one. The Irish diaspora in America, particularly the waves that came during and after the famine, were concentrated in urban environments, in the industrial cities of the Northeast, in conditions of poverty and overcrowding that were genuinely devastating. They died in high numbers from infectious disease. Tuberculosis was catastrophic in Irish immigrant communities. Cholera, typhus, the same diseases that had helped create the famine mortality crossed the Atlantic with the survivors. But here is what is interesting from a population genetics perspective. Tuberculosis resistance has a genetic component. Variants in genes involved in immune response, in lung physiology, in vitamin D metabolism, show different frequencies in populations that have historically experienced high tuberculosis mortality. The Irish, who experienced extraordinarily high tuberculosis mortality both during the famine period and in the diaspora, show specific patterns in immune-related genes that may reflect historical selection for tuberculosis resistance, or, alternatively, may reflect the removal from the reproductive population of individuals who lacked resistance. This is called purifying selection. When an infectious disease kills a large proportion of a population, It preferentially removes from the gene pool individuals whose immune systems cannot control the infection. Over generations, if the disease persists, the population becomes more genetically resistant because the susceptible individuals are not reproducing. The Irish went through this process with tuberculosis at an extreme level in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The genetic consequences of that bottleneck are still being studied. The connection to the broader story of Irish physical distinctiveness is this. The very things that made the Irish genetically distinctive, the WHG ancestry that includes specific immune system variants, the isolation that preserved those variants at high frequency, the demographic history that repeatedly bottlenecked the population in ways that amplified specific genetic signals, all of these are part of the same story. They are not separate phenomena. They are aspects of the same underlying dynamic, which is what happens to a population that is isolated, repeatedly stressed, repeatedly culled by disease and disaster, and that carries a genetic baseline different from the European average because of its ancient origins and its geographic position. Now let us go to something that most discussions of Irish genetics completely skip over, because it requires engaging with material that is genuinely controversial, genuinely uncertain, and genuinely fascinating in ways that responsible academics approach carefully. The question of what, if anything, lies behind the specific distribution of Irish genetic characteristics globally. The Irish diaspora has been studied extensively by population geneticists, not specifically for what it reveals about Irish genetics, but because it is one of the most extensive human migration events of the historical period and provides excellent natural experiments in how genes spread and mix when populations move. And the diaspora data shows something worth noting. The physical characteristics associated with Irish genetics, pale skin, light eyes, red or auburn hair, do not dilute uniformly in diaspora populations over generations. They dilute, certainly. Second and third generation Irish Americans with one Irish and one non-Irish parent will have intermediate characteristics rather than Irish characteristics. But the traits persist at detectable frequencies much further into the diaspora than simple averaging would predict, for two related reasons. The first is assortative mating, the tendency for people to choose partners who resemble themselves. Within diaspora communities, Irish immigrants and their descendants preferentially married other Irish immigrants and their descendants, at least in the early generations. This maintained the specifically Irish genetic profile within the community, even as the community was physically located in America or Australia rather than Ireland. The second is the way genetics actually works with traits like this. The MC1R variants for red hair do not average. You either have them or you do not. If you have two copies, you have red hair. If you have one copy, you are a carrier and may or may not express red hair depending on other factors, but your children have a 50% chance of inheriting the variant. The traits do not vanish in a generation. They recede into the population as carrier status and re-emerge in unexpected places several generations later. This is why you occasionally encounter strongly Irish-looking faces in families that have been out of Ireland for 4 or 5 generations, in places like the American South or the Australian outback, in families that have long since stopped identifying primarily as Irish. The genetics persisted when the cultural identity did not. The pale skin and the blue eyes and the particular bone structure appeared in a great-grandchild whose great-grandparent left County Clare in 1848, and the grandparents looked at this child and said, "She got the Irish in her," and they were right, and they did not need a genetics test to know it. This persistence, this tendency of Irish genetic characteristics to resurface across generations and geographies, is part of what makes the distinctiveness of the Irish face something that people notice, even when they cannot articulate why they notice it. The pattern keeps appearing, in unexpected places, in unexpected people, and behind the pattern, all the way back, is the island at the edge of the Atlantic, and the WHG ancestry that the island preserved when the rest of Europe was not preserving it. There is something worth saying about the specific combination of characteristics that defines what we think of as the Irish face, because the combination is the point. Pale skin alone is not distinctive, Scandinavians have it. Light eyes alone are not distinctive, many Northern Europeans have them. Dark hair alone is not unusual, but the specific combination, in the specific proportions, with the specific skull morphology and the specific pigmentation patterns, is unusual. It is a coherent genetic signature that hangs together as a package because it originated as a package in a population that had been evolving in isolation long enough for its characteristics to become correlated with each other. And there is one characteristic that gets almost no attention in popular discussions, but that physical anthropologists consider highly diagnostic for populations with high WHG ancestry: the nose. Irish people, and by extension people of Irish ancestry, show a specific nasal morphology that differs statistically from most continental European populations. Not dramatically, subtly, but the nose tends toward broader at the bridge, with a specific angle of projection and a particular shaping of the nostrils that reflects the WHG heritage. Physical anthropologists who work with skeletal remains can identify WHG ancestry from the nasal aperture of the skull with reasonably high accuracy. And the modern Irish face shows that same signature, attenuated by thousands of years of admixture, but still detectable in population studies. This is not something people usually know. The popular narrative about Irish physical distinctiveness focuses on the skin and eyes and hair because those are the most immediately visible. The skeletal characteristics are visible too, but you need to know what to look for. Physical anthropologists know what to look for. And what they see in Irish skeletal collections, both historical and modern, is consistent with what the ancient DNA is revealing. A population that has retained more of the pre-agricultural Western European baseline than any other. Let us now consider the island's mythology one more time, because the mythology is not just cultural decoration on top of the genetic story. It is, in some ways, the genetic story told in the only language available before modern science. The Irish mythological tradition divides the prehistorical inhabitants of Ireland into a series of successive peoples, each displaced by the next. This is called the Lebor Gabala Eren, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, compiled in medieval manuscripts from much older oral traditions. The successive peoples include the Fomorians, the Partholonians, the Nemedians, the Fir-Bolg, the Tuatha De Danann, and finally the Milesians, who are the ancestors of the historical Irish. What is striking, when you compare this mythological sequence to what the ancient DNA is revealing about the actual prehistoric sequence of populations in Ireland, is the correspondence. Not in the specific details, not in the names and the supernatural episodes, but in the structure. The mythology remembers that there were multiple successive populations in Ireland before the historical period. It remembers that each new population did not simply replace the previous one but displaced it into a different domain, the Fomorians into the sea, the Tuatha De Danann into the underground, the previous peoples into the margins. It remembers that the previous populations did not vanish but persisted, accessible through specific places and specific practices. The ancient DNA shows multiple successive population layers in Ireland. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic farmers, the Bronze Age steppe people, and the Iron Age arrivals. Each layer modified, but did not completely erase the previous one. The mythology is not a precise historical record. It is a mythologized memory of a real process, the process of successive migration and admixture that produced the Irish genetic profile. The Tuatha De Danann, who retreat into the underground hills when the Milesians arrive, are particularly interesting in this context. In the ancient DNA, the Neolithic people, who built the Great Passage tombs and who carried the WHG ancestry at higher frequencies than their successors, were indeed displaced, or more accurately absorbed and marginalized, by the Bronze Age steppe arrivals. And the Passage tombs, the great mounds, the hills in the landscape, became associated in mythology with the previous divine population. The mounds became the Sids, the doors to the other world, the dwellings of the Tuatha De Danann. This is mythological memory, encoding a real genetic and demographic event. The people who built the mounds, the Neolithic Irish with their unusually high WHG ancestry and their sophisticated astronomical knowledge, were displaced from cultural dominance by the Bronze Age arrivals. But they did not vanish. They persisted in the population, their genes blending into the new mixture, their sacred places remaining sacred places under new mythological frameworks. The Tuatha De Danann never leave Ireland in the mythology. They go underground, they persist, and so do their genes, in the Irish people who have never entirely lost the face and the blood and the particular quality of attention that the Atlantic fringe preserves. There is something in the persistence of that genetic signal that feels like a statement about the nature of identity itself. Identity, we are taught, is cultural. It is language and religion, and custom and cuisine, and the stories you tell about yourself. All of these things can be adopted and discarded. You can learn a language, convert a religion, adopt new customs, but you cannot adopt genes. The genetic layer of identity is not chosen and cannot be unchosen. It goes back to whoever your ancestors were, wherever they lived, whatever they experienced in their environment over thousands of years. For the Irish, that genetic layer goes back in a relatively uninterrupted line to the people who first walked the island 12,000 years ago. Not perfectly, not without admixture and change, but more directly, more continuously than almost any other European population can claim. The farmers who came modified the hunter-gatherer baseline, but did not erase it. The steppe people who came modified the farming population, but did not erase the accumulated WHG signal. The historical arrivals, the Vikings and Normans and English, modified the Irish population but did not erase the ancient Atlantic ancestry. The reason the Irish look different is that they are different. Specifically different, in specific ways, that reflect a specific history of isolation and persistence on a specific island, in a specific ocean, at a specific edge of the world. The difference is real. The difference is genetic. And the genetics trace back, consistently and clearly, to a population that was already ancient when history began. Now we need to address something that careful science usually brackets and that popular discussion usually exaggerates: the question of whether any of this genetic distinctiveness matters, whether it should matter to the Irish themselves, whether it should matter to the world. The answer to whether it matters to the Irish themselves is that it already does, whether people know the science behind it or not. Irish identity has always been deeply invested in distinctiveness. The history of the island, centuries of colonial relationship with Britain, the suppression of the Irish language, the attempted erasure of specific cultural practices, the famine and the emigration, all of these experiences intensified rather than diminished the investment in a distinctively Irish identity. People fought and died and emigrated and starved for the right to be specifically Irish, rather than absorbed into a broader British or European identity. What the genetics reveals is that this investment is not sentimental fantasy. The distinctiveness that Irish people have always insisted upon is real. It is written in the DNA. It is visible in the faces. It is present in the blood group frequencies and the skull morphology and the gene variants that differ from the European average in consistent and explicable ways. The Irish are not being romantic or nationalist when they insist on their distinctiveness. They are being accurate. Whether this distinctiveness matters to the world is a different question. The scientific answer is that it matters to population genetics, because the Irish genome represents a unique window into the pre-agricultural Western European population. The high WHG ancestry in the Irish means that studying the Irish genome provides information about what the ancient Atlantic population looked like that cannot be obtained as clearly from any other modern population. The Irish are, in a very literal sense, living archives of a genetic heritage that has mostly been overwritten elsewhere. From a medical perspective, the Irish genetic distinctiveness matters because the elevated frequencies of specific variants, the MC1R variants, the blood group characteristics, the immune system profiles, correlate with specific medical risk patterns. Irish people, and people of Irish ancestry globally, have elevated rates of certain conditions, including hemochromatosis, a genetic iron storage disorder that occurs at the highest known frequencies in Ireland of any population in the world. They have elevated rates of certain skin conditions related to the pale skin and reduced melanin protection. They have specific patterns of drug metabolism that affect pharmaceutical dosing. The medical genetics of the Irish population is distinct enough to be clinically relevant. But perhaps the most important reason the distinctiveness matters is simply that it is true. Truth matters, regardless of practical application. The story of how the Irish came to look the way they look, the story of the Western hunter-gatherers and the Iberian refugium and the Atlantic maritime culture and the 12,000 years of island history, is one of the most remarkable stories in human prehistory. It deserves to be known, Not because it confers any advantage or superiority, not because it makes the Irish special in a way that diminishes anyone else, but because it is a story about human survival and persistence and the way that geography and demography and genetics interact to produce the extraordinary diversity of human faces across the world. Every human face is a record. It encodes, in its pigmentation and its bone structure and its proportions, information about where its ancestors lived, what environments they adapted to, what challenges they survived. The Irish face, with its particular combination of ancient Atlantic characteristics, preserved at high frequency by 12,000 years of island isolation, is one of the most legible records we have. It is a face you can read if you know the language. And the language is genetics. Let us talk now about what comes next, because science is not finished with this story. It is, in some ways, just beginning. The field of ancient DNA analysis has transformed in the last 15 years more dramatically than in the previous century of physical anthropology combined. The technical capacity to extract, sequence, and analyze DNA from ancient remains, to pull genetic information from bones that have been in the ground for thousands or tens of thousands of years, has improved at a rate that is genuinely breathtaking. Samples that 10 years ago would have yielded nothing now yield complete genomes. Sites that were previously inaccessible to genetic study are now being sampled. The picture is being filled in at an accelerating pace. For Ireland specifically, the ancient DNA record is still relatively sparse by the standards of what is now possible. There are hundreds of ancient Irish individuals sequenced, which sounds like a lot but is not when spread across 12,000 years of island occupation. Large portions of Irish prehistory are essentially blank in the genetic record, not because the people were not there, but because the right samples have not yet been sequenced. The Mesolithic period, the first thousands of years of Irish habitation, is represented by only a handful of genetic samples, almost all from the same period and the same region. What the next decades of research will produce, as more samples are sequenced, as the geographic and temporal coverage improves, is a much higher resolution picture of how the Irish genetic profile developed over time. We will be able to track, in detail, the arrival of the Neolithic farmers and their mixing with the Mesolithic hunters. We will be able to see the Bronze Age steppe transition in real time, watching the frequencies of different ancestry components change decade by decade across different regions of the island. We will be able to determine whether the Iron Age, Celtic transition is visible in the genetics, or whether it truly happened without significant new population input. We will be able to understand the Viking and Norman genetic impacts at the level of specific communities and specific generations. And we will, almost certainly, find surprises. Ancient DNA almost always produces surprises when it is applied to populations where the historical record is sparse. The surprises are not usually dramatic reversals of everything that was thought before. They tend to be refinements, complications, additions of previously unsuspected layers, but they accumulate into a picture that is more interesting, more complex, more true than the simplified version that preceded it. There is also the question of what modern population genetics, applied to the living Irish population at a level of resolution that was not previously possible, might reveal. The technology for sequencing full human genomes has become cheap enough that population-scale studies are now feasible. Studies of hundreds of thousands or millions of people with enough geographic and genealogical detail to identify fine-scale population structure within Ireland are beginning to appear in the literature. These studies are already showing that the Irish population has more internal structure than was previously appreciated. The east-west gradient in WHG Ancestry is real and measurable. But there are also north-south gradients, and gradients along the coastlines versus the interior, and local clustering patterns that reflect the history of specific communities going back centuries or millennia. The Irish population is not homogeneous. It is a patchwork of subtly different local populations, each with its own history of isolation and mixture, each carrying slightly different frequencies of the ancestral components that make up the overall Irish genetic profile. Within that patchwork, some communities carry the ancient WHG signal at even higher concentrations than the national average. Some island communities, some coastal communities in the West, show WHG ancestry proportions that approach what we see in the ancient Mesolithic individuals. These are the communities where the face of the original Atlantic population is most vividly preserved. Where the physical characteristics that we have been discussing, the skin and eyes and hair and skull shape, appear in their most concentrated form. These communities are also, almost universally, the communities that retained the Irish language longest. The linguistic and the genetic are telling the same story from different angles. The places where the oldest layer of Irish identity is most concentrated are the places that have been most isolated, most resistant to the successive waves of outside influence, most rooted in the landscape and the practices that have defined Atlantic Irish life since the first human beings walked down to the western shore and stood in the Atlantic wind, looking out at the water. What lies ahead for these communities, and for the Irish population more broadly, is a question that genetics cannot answer. Demographics can describe it. Immigration into Ireland has changed the genetic composition of the country's cities in ways that will, over generations, affect the overall Irish genetic profile. This is not something to lament or celebrate. It is simply what happens when a population becomes the destination for migration rather than purely the source of it. The Irish genome will continue to change, as it always has, absorbing new inputs, while the deep WHG-heavy baseline continues to exert its influence on the overall mixture. What will not change, or will change only slowly across many generations, is the genetic memory that sits in the most isolated communities, in the islands and the western peninsulas, in the places where the world has not changed as fast. There, the face of the Atlantic hunter-gatherer, modified but not erased by 12,000 years of history, will continue to look out at the water, and the water will continue to be the same water it always was. The sea that separated Ireland from the rest of the world and made it what it is. There is something to say about the relationship between the Irish and their landscape that goes beyond what genetics or archaeology or history can fully capture. Something that is in the experience of the place itself, in the specific quality of being in Western Ireland. On a grey afternoon, when the light is low and the bog is stretching out in every direction, and the Atlantic wind is doing what Atlantic winds do, which is to make you feel extremely small and extremely alive simultaneously. People who have been to that landscape often describe it as haunted, not in a supernatural sense, but in a sense of density, of layering, of the feeling that the past is very close, almost tangible. The bog preserves things. The bog has given up bodies, perfectly preserved after 2,000 years, with their hair and their skin and the last expression on their face still visible. The bog holds the preserved remnants of the ancient fields under it, the Said system in Mayo, the field walls of people who farmed this land before the pyramids were built. The landscape is not empty. It is full, not with what is visible, but with what is underneath, with what has been laid down layer by layer over 12,000 years of human occupation. People who grow up in that landscape absorb it. They carry it. The Irish relationship with the land, the particular intensity of that relationship that observers have commented on for centuries, is not simply cultural. It is the product of 12,000 years of a specific people in a specific place. The landscape shaped the people as much as the people shaped the landscape. The boggy, wet, green-grey, wind-scoured Atlantic fringe created selection pressures that acted on the population over generations, and the population's management of that landscape, the burning and the farming and the fishing and the movement of animals, created the landscape that exists today. When an Irish person who has lived in a city their whole life goes to the west of Ireland for the first time and feels something they cannot quite name, a recognition, a rightness, a sense of return without having been there before, that is not imagination. That is, in some sense, genetics. The body knows landscapes its genes have been shaped by. The recognition is real even when the specific person has never been in that specific place. The ancestors who walked that landscape are present in the cells of their descendants, and sometimes the cells remember what the conscious mind has never experienced. This is not mysticism. It is not the sort of claim that would survive peer review in a genetics journal, but it is in the territory between what science can say and what experience suggests, and that territory is real even when it cannot be fully mapped. The Irish have been claiming for centuries that there is something about Ireland that cannot be explained in conventional terms. The genetics is now beginning to provide the conventional terms that were missing. But there is still something left over after the conventional terms have been applied. Something that sits in the landscape and in the face, and in the particular quality of the Irish relationship with time, with the past, with the dead, with the world of story and imagination that bleeds into and out of the factual world in Irish culture, with an ease that can seem, to outsiders, quite strange. The thin places, the Irish call them. The places where the boundary between this world and the other world is thin, where what is normally separate is almost continuous, where you can feel the pressure of the past against the present, like a hand against a membrane. From a genetics perspective, the thin places are everywhere in Ireland. Every field in the west has someone's bones under it. Every bog has preserved the remnants of people who were there before the historical period. Every strand of DNA in every living Irish person carries within it the concatenated experience of ancestors who lived on that island across 12,000 years of climate change and demographic upheaval and cultural transformation. The past is not past, it is present in the genes. The ancestral is not memory, it is biology. And the face is the evidence. The Irish face, the one that comes from the western shore and from the pre-agricultural Atlantic and from the Iberian refugium, where the ancestral population waited out the Ice Age, is the most visible proof of how close the past really is. It is not a historical artifact. It is not something preserved in a museum. It is walking around on living people, going to shops and driving cars and using phones, but it carries within it, inscribed in its pigmentation and its bone structure and its immune system, the record of everything that happened to produce it. That is what you are looking at when you look at an Irish face. Not a curiosity, not a stereotype, not a national identity badge. A document written in the language of DNA, 12,000 years old and still legible. Let us now examine one more dimension that has not been adequately discussed in popular treatments of Irish genetics. The question of what happened to the specific WHG population characteristics during the periods of intense historical stress that Ireland experienced, particularly during the early medieval period, and the successive plantation and colonial experiences of the 16th through 19th centuries. The early medieval period in Ireland, roughly from the 5th to the 12th century, was a period of extraordinary cultural flowering combined with significant demographic turbulence. The monastic movement produced some of the finest manuscript illumination in the world. The Book of Kells, produced sometime around 800 CE, is still considered one of the great masterpieces of Western visual art. Irish missionaries carried Christianity and learning to a post-Roman Europe that had largely lost its literate culture. The Irish scholar monks travelled as far as Iceland and possibly the North American continent, certainly to the coasts of Greenland, if the accounts in the Navigatio Sancti Brendani are taken as containing any historical core. At the same time, Ireland was experiencing the beginnings of the Viking raids, which escalated into Viking settlement, and eventually a complex pattern of Norse-Irish interaction that reshaped the demographic map of the island's eastern coastline. The Norse founded Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, Cork. They created the trading network that connected Ireland to the broader Viking world, from Norway through the Scottish Isles, through Ireland to Iceland and beyond. And they intermarried. The Norse who settled in Ireland were not a colonial population that maintained strict endogamy. Within a generation or two, they were blending with the Irish population around them, producing children who carried Norse genes but grew up speaking Irish and participating in Irish culture. The genetic signature of this Norse admixture is visible in modern Irish populations, particularly in the areas of heaviest Norse settlement. But it is not a dominant signature. The Norse were, in genetic terms, not so different from what was already in Ireland. They had their own mix of WHG ancestry and steppe ancestry, somewhat different in proportions from the Irish mix, but not entirely alien to it. The addition of Norse genetic material to the Eastern Irish population produced a subtle shift in ancestry proportions, but did not dramatically alter the fundamental character of the Irish genome. The Norman conquest of the 12th century introduced a more distinctly continental genetic input. The Normans, by the time they arrived in Ireland in 1169, had spent 2 centuries in northern France and had incorporated significant Frankish and Gaulish ancestry alongside their Norse heritage. Their genetic profile was more Anatolian farmer-heavy than the Norse, reflecting the agricultural populations of northern France. The Norman families who established themselves in Leinster and Munster, The families whose names became the great Irish surnames, the Fitzgeralds and the Burkes and the Butlers and the Roches, all added their continental genetic contribution to the Irish mix. But the famous phrase about the Normans, that they became more Irish than the Irish themselves, encodes a real demographic truth. The Norman settler families in Ireland, outside the Pale around Dublin, were a minority in the midst of a much larger Irish population. Intermarriage was the norm rather than the exception within a few generations. The genetic signal of Norman ancestry dispersed rapidly through the Irish population, becoming diluted by the larger existing gene pool in exactly the way that small immigrant populations always dilute into larger host populations over time. The plantation of Ulster in the early 17th century, the systematic replacement of the native Irish Catholic population in the northeast of the island with Scottish and English Protestant settlers, introduced a different kind of genetic input. The Scottish planters, particularly, brought with them genetic profiles that were themselves high in WHG ancestry, reflecting the same Atlantic coastal heritage that characterized the existing Irish population in different proportions. The Ulster Scots, as they came to be called, were not genetically alien to the Irish they settled among. They were, in deep genetic terms, cousins, different in religion, different in culture, different in political allegiance, but carriers of the same broad Atlantic genetic heritage. This is one of the more remarkable facts about the Ulster situation, politically, one of the most contentious in recent European history. The genetic distance between the populations that have been in violent conflict over the question of Irish identity, the Catholic nationalist community and the Protestant unionist community, is small. Both communities descend primarily from Atlantic coastal populations with high WHG ancestry. The cultural and political differences that divided them are real and have real consequences. But the genetic differences are subtle, the product of a few centuries of somewhat separate demographic history within the same broad Atlantic population. The 19th century and its catastrophe brought the most significant demographic event in recorded Irish history. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 killed approximately 1 million people and drove another million to emigrate in just a few years. By 1901, the population of Ireland had fallen to around 4.5 million from a pre-famine peak of over 8 million. The demographic collapse continued through emigration long after the famine itself ended. Ireland was unique among European nations in having a continuously declining population throughout the 19th and most of the 20th century. The genetic consequences of this collapse are still being studied. Bottlenecks reduce genetic diversity. When a large population is rapidly reduced and then rebuilt from the survivors, the genetic profile of the rebuilt population reflects the characteristics of the survivors rather than the full diversity of the pre-bottleneck population. The famine survivors were not a random sample of the pre-famine Irish. They were differentially the population of the East, of the towns, of the areas with more economic connections to markets and with more dietary diversity. The populations of the West, most dependent on the potato and most lacking economic alternatives, were most devastated. This means that the post-famine Irish population is not identical to the pre-famine Irish population in its genetic characteristics. The WHG heavy signal of the Western population was reduced in frequency within Ireland by the differential mortality and emigration of the famine. The genetic distinctiveness that characterizes the most isolated Western communities today would have been even more pronounced in the pre-famine population. What the famine took from Ireland was not just people. It took a genetic heritage, concentrated in the most ancient layers of the population, and dispersed it around the world, in the bodies of emigrants who settled in American cities and Australian towns and British industrial centres, far from the Atlantic shore that had shaped them. The Irish diaspora is, from a genetics perspective, the dispersal of a very old genetic signal into the global gene pool. The WHG ancestry that was concentrated on an island on the edge of the world for 12,000 years has, in the last 2 centuries, begun to mix into the broader global population through the mechanism of Irish emigration. In 100 years, or 200, or 500, the specifically Irish genetic profile will be more diluted in the world population than it is now. The traits will persist, not as a coherent cluster, but as individual variants scattered through a more diverse genetic background. Someone in 2300 might carry the red hair variant from an Irish ancestor 7 generations back, without carrying any of the other characteristics. The coherent package will disperse, as all packages disperse over sufficient time and sufficient mixing. But for now, in this historical moment, the package is still largely intact in the people who stayed or who live in the most closely connected communities of the diaspora. The Irish face is still the Irish face. The blood group frequencies are still distinct. The WHG ancestry is still the highest in Western Europe, still carrying the mark of the people who walked north from Iberia when the ice retreated and made a home at the end of the world. Let us go even further back than the Ice Age for a moment, further than the Iberian refugium, further than the Western hunter-gatherers. Let us ask where the WHG population itself came from. Because the WHG were not the beginning, they were themselves the product of a longer story. The modern human lineage in Europe traces back to populations that left Africa roughly 60 to 80,000 years ago, crossed through the Middle East, and began spreading into the rest of Eurasia. Some of these populations went east into Asia, and eventually to the Americas and Australia. Others went north and west into Europe. The ones who went into Europe became what we call the Upper Paleolithic Europeans, and eventually the Western hunter-gatherers. But the relationship between these early European populations and the populations that were already in Eurasia before the modern humans arrived, particularly the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, was not simply one of replacement. We know now, from ancient DNA evidence, that modern humans bred with Neanderthals multiple times. The genetic signature of Neanderthal ancestry is present in all modern, non-African humans at rates of 1 to 4%. And the WHG population, the ancestors of the Irish, were among the earliest and most extensive carriers of Neanderthal ancestry in the European record. This is not a scandalous or disturbing fact. It is simply the record of what happened when two cognitively sophisticated human populations encountered each other in Europe 40 to 50,000 years ago. They did what human populations do when they encounter each other. They interacted, they competed, they sometimes fought, and they sometimes reproduced together. The Neanderthal genes that filtered into the early European population were not random noise. Some of them appear to have conferred advantages in the new European environment, advantages in immune function, in skin physiology, in metabolism, that helped the modern humans survive in a climate and landscape that the Neanderthals had already adapted to over hundreds of thousands of years. The Irish, with their high WHG ancestry, carry Neanderthal genetic variants at rates consistent with the broader non-African range. They are not exceptional in this regard, but the WHG genetic background that gives those variants their context, the particular combination of ancient European ancestry components that the Irish have retained more completely than other populations, places them in a particular relationship to the Neanderthal ancestry. The Neanderthal-derived variants are sitting in a genetic context that has been less mixed with later Anatolian and steppe input than is the case for most continental Europeans, which means, in a very limited sense, that the Neanderthal ancestry in the Irish genome is slightly less diluted by later admixture than the same Neanderthal ancestry in the genomes of populations where the WHG component is smaller. This is not a meaningful practical difference. The Neanderthal ancestry in any modern human genome is too small and too dispersed to have obvious phenotypic consequences independent of the surrounding modern human genetic background. But it is another layer of the story. Another reason why the Irish genetic profile, when you trace it back to its deepest roots, connects to things that are older than Ireland, older than Europe, older than modern human civilization, connections that run back through the Iberian refugium and through the Upper Paleolithic Europeans, and through the mixing events in the Near East 45,000 years ago, when modern humans first encountered Neanderthals in the landscape they were moving into. The Irish face, in a very literal sense, carries evolutionary history going back not 12,000 years but more than 40,000. The WHG ancestry that dominates it was itself shaped over tens of thousands of years by the specific challenges of European Paleolithic life, by Ice Age conditions, and the resources available in Atlantic coastal refugia and the population bottlenecks that concentrated specific genetic variants. All of that history is present in the face that the genetic studies are now able to read. When you look at an Irish face and feel that quality of recognition, that sense of something ancient. You are not imagining it. You are responding to something that is genuinely there. The face is genuinely ancient in its genetic roots. The perception of antiquity in the appearance is accurate, even if the conscious mind that perceives it cannot articulate why. Before we draw this toward its conclusion, there is one more thing to address: the political dimension. Because any discussion of why a specific group of people looks a specific way has, in the context of European history, been used as a weapon. Physical distinctiveness has been deployed to claim superiority, to justify exclusion, to argue for hierarchies of humanity that were always false and always brutal in their consequences. The Irish themselves know this history from the inside. The 19th century was full of British pseudo-scientific arguments about Irish racial inferiority. Caricatures in the popular press showed Irish people with ape-like features, thick skulls, sloping foreheads. Cranial measurements were taken and interpreted to show that the Irish were less evolved, less intelligent, less fit for self-government than the Anglo-Saxon population. These arguments were not peripheral. They were mainstream. They were used to justify policies that contributed to famine mortality. They were used to rationalize the suppression of Irish culture, language, and political agency. The genetics being discussed in this script is the antidote to that history, not a continuation of it. The WHG ancestry that makes the Irish distinct does not make them inferior or superior. It makes them specifically old in a specific way. It makes them the primary surviving carriers of a genetic heritage that was once distributed more broadly across Atlantic Europe. It connects them to the most ancient layers of European human prehistory in ways that are simply interesting, simply true, simply part of the extraordinary complexity of how our species spread across the world and diversified and mixed and diversified again over hundreds of thousands of years. Any use of this information to argue for Irish superiority or for the superiority of any other group with similar characteristics would be as wrong as the arguments for inferiority that were made against the Irish in the 19th century. The genetics describes what happened. It does not rank what happened. It does not say that high WHG ancestry is better or worse than high Anatolian farmer ancestry or high steppe ancestry. It says that different historical processes produce different genetic outcomes in different places, and that those outcomes are interesting and worth understanding. The Irish face is not a superior face or an inferior face. It is a specific face with a specific history. That history is remarkable. The specificity is real. The antiquity is genuine. And the story of how that face came to be, 12,000 years of island genetics on the edge of the Atlantic world, is one of the more extraordinary stories in human prehistory. It deserves to be known, not as ammunition for any political agenda, not as proof of any hierarchy, just as what it is, an extraordinary fact about an extraordinary people, preserved by geography and history against the forces that might have erased it, still visible in the faces of people who live on that island and in the descendants of those who left it, looking out at the world with eyes that carry the light of an Atlantic sky, 12,000 years in the making. The island is still there. The water is still there. The light is still the specific Atlantic light, filtered through moisture, diffuse and soft and grey-green and beautiful in its particular way. And the people who stand in that light, who look out at that water, who carry in their cells the concatenated genetic experience of every generation that lived on that island since the first ones arrived, they are still there too, still looking, still carrying it, still being exactly what 12,000 years of island life made them. The real reason the Irish look different is that they are the last clear window into something that was once more widespread but is now mostly gone. They are the living archive of the Western hunter-gatherer face, the endpoint of a journey that began in Africa more than 60,000 years ago, paused in the Iberian refugium for tens of thousands of years of ice age, and then moved north along the Atlantic shore to the final island, the last landfall before the open ocean. They made it all the way to the end, and they stayed. And the staying made them what they are. And what they are is old, older than history, older than civilization, older than any story that was ever written down, carrying in their faces and their blood a record of everything that made them, still readable if you know the language. Now you know the language, and you know why the face is different. And the next time you see it, whether in Ireland itself or in a city on the other side of the world, you will know what you are looking at. Not just a face, a document. A 12,000-year-old document written in genetics, sealed in the particular isolation of an island at the edge of the world, and still legible today. That is the story. It does not end cleanly because the story is still happening. The people who carry the WHG ancestry are still alive. The genetics is still being studied. New samples are still being sequenced. New papers are still being published. The picture is still being filled in. And every new fragment of data, every new ancient genome, every new population study adds to a narrative that was already one of the most extraordinary in human prehistory, and that keeps getting more extraordinary as the resolution improves. Watch this space. The science of who the Irish are and why they look the way they look is not finished. It may never be fully finished, because the past has more layers than any present can fully excavate. But what we know now is already enough to transform the story that we tell about the island at the edge of the world and the people who kept their ancient face when the rest of Europe was losing theirs. The water was there first, then the people came, and neither the water nor the people have gone anywhere. They are still there, still in relationship with each other, still producing, generation by generation, the face that the world finds somehow ancient without knowing why. Now you know why. The island kept its secret for 12,000 years. The DNA finally told it, and it turned out to be, as secrets often are when they are finally revealed, not a dramatic rupture with what was already suspected, but a confirmation, in precise scientific language, of what the faces themselves had been saying all along. Let us travel into territory that is rarely covered in mainstream discussions of Irish genetics, because it involves reading archaeological and genetic evidence through a lens that most academic papers are too cautious to apply directly. The question of whether Ireland's distinctiveness extends beyond the physical into what might be called the cognitive or perceptual, and whether the particular history of the island and its people has produced ways of being in the world that differ not just culturally, but in ways that have some biological substrate. This requires beginning with a distinction. Culture shapes behavior. This is incontestable and accounts for the vast majority of observable differences between human populations in how they organize themselves, what they value, how they communicate. Culture is learned, transmitted across generations, through language and practice and example, and can change within a single lifetime. Biology shapes propensity. This is less well understood, more contested, and subject to violent misuse historically. But the basic principle that genetic variants can affect aspects of physiology that influence behavioral tendencies at a population level is accepted science, even if the specific details are often uncertain. What the Irish case presents is a population that has been in relative isolation for longer than almost any other European population, subject to specific environmental pressures and specific demographic events, with a specific genetic baseline that differs from the European average in documented ways. The question is whether any of that genetic specificity, in combination with the specific cultural traditions that developed on the island, has produced tendencies that are observable and that cannot be fully explained by culture alone. The first thing to consider is sensory sensitivity. The Irish environment is unusual in specific ways that would, over thousands of years, exert selection pressure on sensory systems. The Atlantic light, diffuse and low contrast, requires a visual system calibrated differently from the sharp, high-contrast light of more southerly or more continental environments. The sounds of the Atlantic environment, wind and water dominant, complex and layered, would favor auditory systems capable of extracting signal from noise. The landscape, full of subtle gradations of color and texture rather than dramatic contrasts, would favor fine visual discrimination. There is literature, not large but real, suggesting that populations adapted to certain visual environments show measurable differences in color discrimination and spatial processing. The specific characteristics of Irish visual environments might be expected to produce, over thousands of years, populations with particular visual processing tendencies. Whether such tendencies exist at measurable levels in modern Irish populations has not been studied in a way that accounts for the genetic history being discussed here. But the cultural evidence is consistent with the hypothesis. The extraordinary tradition of verbal art in Irish culture, the centrality of storytelling, the sophistication of traditional music, the poetry tradition that extends back to the Philid of early medieval Ireland. All of these suggest a population with highly developed language and pattern recognition capacities. These are capacities that would be advantageous in a sensory environment dominated by sound and subtle visual complexity rather than stark visual contrasts. The Irish musical tradition is worth examining in this context because it is unusual even within the Celtic world. Traditional Irish music has a rhythmic complexity and a melodic sophistication that musicians from other traditions often find difficult to internalize at first. The ornamentation system, the cuts and rolls and triplets that give Irish traditional music its characteristic texture, requires a kind of fine motor control and rhythmic awareness that takes years to develop, even for talented musicians from non-Irish backgrounds. Irish musicians who grow up in the tradition absorb it in childhood and can execute it with a naturalness that seems effortless but represents an extraordinary level of neural integration. This is a cultural transmission phenomenon, not primarily a genetic one, but cultural traditions are not entirely independent of the populations that carry them. A tradition of verbal and musical art this sophisticated, maintained over this longer period, in a population of this size, in conditions of relative isolation, may have had some feedback relationship with the genetic composition of the population that carried it. Cultural pressures can become selection pressures if the culture rewards specific capacities differentially enough and consistently enough over sufficient generations. We cannot prove this for Ireland. The necessary studies have not been done with the necessary controls and the necessary sophistication to make strong claims. But the question is legitimate, and the evidence is at least consistent with the hypothesis that there is something genuinely distinctive about the Irish cognitive and perceptual profile that has a genetic component alongside its cultural one. There is also the question of the Irish relationship with time, with the past specifically. Irish culture has a relationship with historical time that strikes outsiders as unusual, sometimes beautifully unusual, sometimes uncomfortably so. The famine is not ancient history in Irish culture. It happened 3 to 4 generations ago and is experienced by many Irish people with an emotional immediacy that people from outside the tradition sometimes find confusing. Events from the 17th century, the Cromwellian Wars, the Ulster Plantation, the 1641 massacres, remain live political and cultural references in Ireland in ways that comparable events do not in other European countries. This might be explained entirely by historical and political factors, by the fact that Ireland's colonial relationship with Britain meant that the wounds were kept open by continuing political struggle rather than allowed to close through resolution. And that explanation is substantially correct. But there may be a genetic component to the Irish relationship with historical memory as well, specifically in the way that the oral tradition that functioned as the primary information preservation system for Irish culture for thousands of years would have selected for particular types of memory, particular emotional relationships with narrative, particular ways of encoding and accessing the past. Hunter-gatherer societies globally share a characteristic approach to memory and history that is different from the approach of literate, state-organized societies. Hunter-gatherers maintain memory in landscape, in story, in relationship network, rather than in written record. The Irish, despite having had a written tradition since the early medieval period, maintained the primacy of the oral tradition much longer than most European populations, and the oral tradition has its own characteristic relationship with time. In oral cultures, the past is not dead. It is continuously present in the stories that keep it alive. The ancestors are available through the right kind of attention. The events of distant time have the same emotional weight as events of recent time because they are accessed through the same narrative mechanisms. The Irish relationship with the past, the emotional proximity of historical events that outsiders see as distant, may be, in part, the persistence of a hunter-gatherer relationship with time in a population that retained more of the hunter-gatherer genetic and cultural baseline than most of Europe. The Tuatha De Danann, who are still available through the SIDS, are not simply mythology. They are a model of how the past works, in which it does not go away, but becomes differently accessible. And that model may have roots in the WHG ancestry that has never been fully displaced. We are, by now, at the edge of what can be said with confidence. The genetics is solid. The ancient DNA evidence for high WHG ancestry in the Irish population is solid. The blood group data, the skull morphology data, the pigmentation genetics. All of these are solid. The historical archaeology, the linguistic evidence for Celtic language in the Atlantic zone, the mythology as encoded memory of demographic transitions. These are well-supported arguments. The more speculative material about cognitive and perceptual tendencies, about the relationship with time and memory, about the possible feedback between cultural tradition and genetic selection is genuine hypothesis, worth considering, worth eventually testing, but not yet established. What can be said with confidence is this. The Irish are genetically distinct from other European populations in ways that are documented and explicable. The distinctiveness traces to specific historical and demographic causes, particularly the unusual preservation of WHG ancestry in a Western island that are now understood at the level of ancient DNA evidence. The physical characteristics that observers have always associated with the Irish, the specific combination of skin, eyes, hair, and bone structure, are the phenotypic expression of that genetic distinctiveness. The cultural characteristics that observers have associated with the Irish, the verbal art, the music, the relationship with landscape and past and story, are consistent with, and may have some biological substrate in the same genetic history, though this is less well established. The island is the key. Geography determined the population history. The population history determined the genetics. The genetics, combined with the cultural traditions that developed in dialogue with the genetics and the landscape, produced the people. The people look the way they look because of where they are, specifically where they are, on an island, at the edge of the Atlantic, at the westernmost point of the Old World, in a position of maximum isolation from the forces that were repeatedly overwriting the European genome. That position, that island, that ocean, turned out to be the place where the most ancient surviving layer of Western European humanity chose to persist. Not chose, exactly, but ended up. The Western hunter-gatherers who colonized Ireland at the end of the last ice age could not have known that they were on an island that would preserve their genetic signal better than any other part of the continent. They were just following the coast north, looking for food, finding a landscape that was green and wet and full of resources after the ice had left it, settling in, building fires on the western shore, and staying, and their children staying, and their children's children staying, for 12,000 years. With all the modifications that history applied, the staying continued. The island held the people held the genetics, and the genetics held, in its proteins and its pigmentation and its particular arrangement of ancient alleles, the memory of where the whole journey began. That is the real reason the Irish look different from every other European. Not a mystery, not a conspiracy, not something lost in legend. Just 12,000 years of staying put in a very specific place at the very edge of the world, carrying very specifically ancient genes, in a body that was shaped by everything the Atlantic had to throw at it. The water and the wind and the particular quality of the light. The bog and the limestone and the basalt cliffs. The mist and the grey sky and the way the colours go from green to grey and back to green again in the course of an afternoon. All of it, working on the same population, generation after generation, amplifying what was already unusual, deepening what was already distinct. The result is a face, old as the island, specific as the Atlantic, and still there, still looking west at the water that brought the ancestors and that never gave them back to the continent that, 12,000 years ago, had only barely begun to imagine it could be crossed. This is not the end of the story. The story of the Irish genome is still being written, in the laboratories where ancient DNA is sequenced, and in the communities where living people carry their genetics into another generation. New papers will appear. New interpretations will be proposed. New layers will be identified in the data that current methods cannot yet see. But what will not change is the basic architecture of the story. The WHG base layer, the Iberian refugium origin, the island isolation, the high retention of ancient Atlantic ancestry, the specific physical characteristics that those factors produce, the face that looks old because it is old, the blood that registers unusual frequencies because it comes from an unusual place in European genetic history. These are the permanent elements. The details will be refined. The story will become more precise and more nuanced as the science advances. But the outline is already visible, already established, already demonstrated by the evidence that has accumulated in the last 15 years of ancient DNA research. The Irish look different because they are carrying something that most of Europe has lost, something that was once more widely distributed, that was the common heritage of the Atlantic coastal populations from Iberia to Ireland, but that has been diluted, overwritten, mixed into something less distinct across most of the continent. In Ireland, it survived. In the faces of the people who live there and in the descendants of those who left, it is still visible, still carrying the ancient signal, still announcing, to anyone who knows how to read it, that this is a population with a specific and extraordinary history. Look at it long enough, and you start to see the island in the face, the grey-green light, the Atlantic sky, the particular quality of a place that kept its people close and kept its people particular. 12,000 years of that, written in the faces of the living. It is, when you understand what you are looking at, one of the most beautiful things genetics has ever shown us. The old faces are still here, still looking out from the westernmost shore of the ancient world, still carrying everything that made them, right down to the allele level, right down to the ancient Atlantic baseline that most of Europe traded away for the advantages of successive migrations. The Irish kept it, not through any choice or plan, through geography, through the ocean, through the particular shape of the world that put an island at the end of the route and made the staying the easier option for long enough that the genetics became what it is. And what it is, in the end, is one of the most extraordinary stories that the science of ancient DNA has given us. Not a mystery, not a myth, just the truth about a people and a place and 12,000 years of the most interesting kind of staying that the human genome has ever managed to do. The face knows. It has always known. Now the science knows too. And now, so do you. That is where we will leave this. Not with a tidy conclusion, because tidy conclusions falsify the complexity that made this story interesting in the first place. But with the recognition that the distinctiveness is real, the explanation is rich, and the face that prompted the question is itself the answer. Look at it. The pale skin built for an Atlantic sky, the eyes that carry the light of the water inside them, the hair that goes from black to copper, the entire range of what darkness does when it is modified by the specific MC1R variants that have been in this population since before history began. The bone structure that the physical anthropologists recognize as WHG, that the ancient DNA confirms as the oldest layer of European humanity visible in any living face. That is the Irish face, old as the island, specific as the place, and still, against all odds, still here, still looking out, still carrying the whole improbable, extraordinary 12,000-year story in every cell of its being. The island kept its people, the people kept their faces, the faces kept the past, and now the past is visible to anyone who knows where to look, written in the genetics, confirmed by the ancient DNA, explained by the history, and still looking back at us from the westernmost shore of the world we thought we knew. That is the story. That is the real reason. And it was there all along, waiting in the bones and the blood, and the particular angle of an Irish cheekbone in Atlantic light, for the science to catch up with what the faces already knew. There is a question that surfaces whenever this topic is discussed among geneticists, archaeologists, and the historians who have begun paying attention to what the ancient DNA evidence is doing to the conventional narrative about European prehistory. The question is why Ireland specifically, not why the Atlantic fringe in general, because the Welsh and the Scots and the Bretons also show elevated WHG ancestry, and also share many of the characteristics that distinguish the Irish from more continental European populations. But why is Ireland the most extreme case? Why is the Irish WHG proportion consistently higher than in populations that seem to have been similarly isolated and similarly close to the Atlantic? The answer involves a confluence of factors that, taken together, created conditions uniquely favorable for the preservation of ancient ancestry in one specific place. The first factor is the sea channel. Ireland is separated from Britain by the Irish Sea, a body of water that, even at the lowest sea levels during the last ice age, was not entirely land. There was a period when the northern part of the channel may have been crossable on foot or by very short boat journey. But for most of the last 12,000 years, reaching Ireland required a sea crossing of some kind. This is not a major barrier for people with basic watercraft. The Irish Sea can be crossed on a reasonable day in a dugout canoe. But it is a barrier that filters population movements. Not every group that wanted to move could move. Not every wave of migration that swept through Britain continued seamlessly into Ireland. The sea channel acted as a selective filter, allowing some migration through while slowing or stopping other movements. This filtering effect meant that Ireland received fewer successive waves of migration than Britain did, and that each wave that did arrive was smaller relative to the existing population than the corresponding wave on the mainland. The Neolithic farmers who transformed Britain substantially also transformed Ireland, but the transformation was less complete because the crossing selected for more motivated or more capable migrants and left behind a proportion of the farming population that was not sufficient to overwhelm the existing hunter-gatherers. The same dynamic applied to the Bronze Age steppe migrations. They entered Ireland, but the island's genetic record shows a somewhat different mixture ratio than Britain's, consistent with fewer steppe people having made the crossing in proportion to the number that settled in Britain. The island was accessible enough for gradual gene flow over centuries, but not porous enough for the kind of rapid, large-scale population replacement that the ancient DNA shows in Central Europe. The second factor is the specific character of the Irish landscape. Ireland is unusually wet, even by Atlantic European standards. The west of Ireland receives more than 2,000 millimeters of rainfall annually in some areas. The land is covered in bog, particularly the raised bogs of the Midlands and the blanket bogs of the west that developed over the last several thousand years as the climate became wetter. The bogs are, to put it bluntly, hostile to certain kinds of agriculture. They are not hospitable to the grain growing that characterized the spread of farming across continental Europe. They do not suit the large-scale pastoralism that the steppe-derived Bronze Age economy favored in the same way. This ecological specificity meant that the farming and herding communities that arrived in Ireland were not able to reproduce the population densities that they achieved on better-suited land. The population density in Ireland during the Neolithic and Bronze Age was lower than in comparable zones of continental Europe, and lower population density means slower genetic dilution of the pre-existing population. When the farmers arrived and mixed with the existing hunter-gatherers, the hunter-gatherers were numerous enough and capable enough of extracting resources from the wet landscape to maintain a substantial genetic presence in the mixed population that resulted. The third factor is the particular history of the post-farming Iron Age period. In continental Europe, the Iron Age saw significant population movements and the introduction of new genetic material from various directions. In Ireland, the Iron Age is archaeologically and genetically more mysterious. The Celtic language arrived, or possibly emerged from within the Atlantic zone. New artistic styles, the Latin tradition, appeared. But the population-level genetic change that in Britain shows a measurable shift with the Iron Age is less clearly visible in the Irish record. The Iron Age in Ireland may have been, in genetic terms, a period of relative stasis, a period when the admixed Bronze Age population continued without major new input. This would mean that the period between the Bronze Age population mixing and the Viking Age, roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years, was a period during which the Irish genetic profile was essentially stable. Stable at a level that had already preserved an unusually high WHG component. 2,000 to 3,000 years of stability, of reproduction within a relatively closed island gene pool, allowed that WHG component to become deeply embedded in the population, to propagate through enough generations that it became, in a real sense, foundational rather than residual. The fourth factor is what did not happen. Ireland was not conquered by Rome. The Romans crossed the Channel and imposed their administration on Britain, introducing Roman-era population movements, Roman soldiers and their families from across the empire, Roman trading connections that brought new people and new genetic material. None of this happened in Ireland. The island was outside the Roman world. It was known to Roman geographers, mapped at least approximately, traded with to a limited degree. But it was not colonized, not garrisoned, not subjected to the population movements that Roman administration produced across the rest of Western Europe. The absence of Roman colonization is not a minor omission. The Roman Empire imported substantial populations of non-Western European ancestry into the territories it administered. Soldiers from North Africa, Syria, the Balkans served in British garrisons, and many of them settled. The genetic evidence from Roman period Britain shows ancestry from across the Roman world. None of this appeared in Ireland at the corresponding period. The Irish genetic pool in the Roman era was developing along lines determined by internal dynamics rather than by the extraordinary population mixing that the Roman Empire produced wherever it extended its reach. All four of these factors, the sea channel filter, the ecologically distinctive wet landscape, the Iron Age stability, and the absence of Roman colonization, combined to produce a population that retained its ancient Atlantic baseline more completely than any other population in Western Europe. And because the WHG ancestry is the oldest layer, the deepest root, the component that was there before the farmers came, the Irish genome became and remains the most legible record of what pre-agricultural Western Europe looked like. There is something almost paradoxical about this. The genetic distinctiveness of the Irish is not the product of isolation in a simple sense, of having been completely cut off from the outside world and developing in complete independence. Ireland had connections to the outside world throughout its prehistory and history. It received genetic input from Iberia and Anatolia, and the steppe and Scandinavia and continental Europe at various points. It absorbed those inputs. But it absorbed them from a position of strength, in a sense, from a baseline that was substantial enough and stable enough to bend the admixture toward itself rather than being overwhelmed by it. Think of it as a conversation between populations rather than a replacement. In most of continental Europe, the conversation ended with the replacement of the hunter-gatherers by the farmers and the subsequent replacement of much of the farmer ancestry by the steppe people. The conversation was decisive. Each new interlocutor dominated the exchange. In Ireland, the conversation was more balanced. Each new interlocutor added their contribution, but the original interlocutor, the WHG population, retained more of its voice in the resulting mixture because the conditions of the conversation were different. The island, the ecology, the demography, all of these modified the terms of exchange in ways that left the original voice audible. That original voice is what you hear in the physical distinctiveness of the Irish. It is old, and it carries the specific acoustic quality of the Atlantic shore, and the long isolation and the particular history of a population that has been in the same conversation with the same island for 12,000 years. You can hear it if you know what to listen for. Now you know. The archaeology of Ireland is itself a record of the same story from a different angle. The objects left behind by the successive populations of Ireland tell a parallel narrative to the one written in the DNA, and that narrative has its own extraordinary chapters. The megalithic monuments of the Neolithic period, the passage tombs of the Boyne Valley, the court cairns of Ulster, the portal dolmens scattered across the island, are among the most impressive achievements of pre-literate humanity anywhere in the world. But they are not the only Neolithic achievement worth noting. The Saïd Fields in County Mayo, already mentioned in the context of the landscape, are equally extraordinary in a different way. The Saïd Fields are the remains of a vast Neolithic field system, preserved under bog that began forming over them approximately 5,000 years ago. What the bog preserved was the outline of an agricultural landscape that extended over approximately 11 square kilometers, organized into field divisions separated by stone walls, with evidence of settlement houses and court tombs embedded within the field system. The scale and the organization of the Saïd Fields demonstrates that the Neolithic Irish were not simply scattered groups of subsistence farmers. They were organized communities capable of coordinating large-scale landscape modification over extended periods. The labor required to build the Saïd field system, to clear the forest that initially covered the landscape, to construct the field walls, to maintain the agricultural organization across generations, implies a social structure considerably more complex than the standard image of Neolithic farming communities suggests. It implies leadership, coordinated decision-making, intergenerational planning, and a level of settled community organization that is, by any reasonable measure, a civilization, even if not one that had writing or cities. And the people who built the Saïd Fields were genetically connected to the people who built Newgrange. They were the Neolithic Irish, the farming population that arrived with the Anatolian farmer ancestry, but that incorporated a higher proportion of WHG ancestry than their continental counterparts. They built in stone, and they organized in landscape in ways that left marks visible 5,000 years later. They were not primitive. They were sophisticated. They were, in their own way, as accomplished as any contemporary civilization on the planet. The Bronze Age metalwork that followed this Neolithic achievement built on it and surpassed it in specific ways. The Irish Bronze Age goldwork, the lunulae, and the gorgets and the tors and the dress fasteners that appear in museum collections across Europe represents a tradition of fine metalworking that was clearly Irish in character and that was clearly exported to elite communities across the Atlantic zone as prestige objects. These objects were not accidentally similar to each other. They were products of a specific Irish tradition, with specific technical requirements and specific aesthetic sensibility. That aesthetic sensibility, the preference for abstract spiral and geometric decoration, for continuous interlaced patterns without a clear beginning or end, for designs that the eye can follow indefinitely without reaching a resolution, is one of the most recognizable and persistent characteristics of Irish art from the Neolithic through the early medieval period. It appears in the megalithic art at Newgrange. It appears in the Bronze Age goldwork. It appears in the Latene metalwork of the Iron Age. It appears, most gloriously, in the illuminated manuscripts of the early medieval period, the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels made by Irish or Irish-trained monks. This visual tradition is not simply an inheritance from the Celtic tradition as it is conventionally understood. It appears in Ireland before the Latin Celtic style arrived on the continent. The spiral art at Newgrange predates the continental Latene tradition by over 1,000 years. And the persistent Irish preference for these visual patterns, their reappearance across every successive cultural period, suggests something about Irish visual cognition or aesthetic preference that has continuity across the demographic changes of the last 5,000 years. Whether this aesthetic continuity has any genetic substrate, whether something about the WHG-heavy Irish genome created a characteristic visual sensibility that was then reinforced through cultural transmission, is impossible to say with current science. But it is worth noting that the most distinctively Irish visual art, the art that outsiders find most specifically Irish, most different from other European visual traditions, shares fundamental characteristics across 5,000 years of Irish history. That kind of continuity usually has roots deeper than any single cultural tradition. The music is similar. The Irish musical tradition, as it exists today in the traditional music of the sessions and the competitions and the recordings, has characteristics that mark it as old. The modes it uses, the Dorian and Mixolydian modes that give traditional Irish music its characteristic emotional quality, are related to the modal system of medieval European music, which itself descends from older Greek and possibly older Near Eastern musical traditions. But the Irish use of these modes has a specific flavour, a specific relationship between melody and rhythm and ornamentation that is different from how the same modes function in other European musical traditions. Traditional musicologists have noted that Irish music, more than most European musical traditions, resists transcription into standard notation. The ornaments that give it its character, the cuts and rolls and triplets, are too fast and too subtle for standard notation to capture adequately. The rhythm, while seemingly regular, contains micro-timings and stresses that notation cannot represent, and the modes, while theoretically the same as their continental counterparts, are applied with an expressiveness and a freedom that is specific to the Irish tradition. Where did this come from? The conventional answer is that it developed over the last several centuries from various inputs, from the singing tradition, from the dance music tradition, from the influence of the harp tradition that was the high-prestige musical form of early medieval Ireland. All of this is true as far as it goes, but it does not explain the specific character of what emerged. Musical traditions everywhere develop from multiple inputs. Not all of them produce something as specifically distinctive as Irish traditional music. The hypothesis worth considering, without being able to prove it, is that Irish music is the expression of a sonic culture that has been developing in a specific environment for a very long time. The specific acoustic qualities of the Irish landscape, the way sound travels in wet, open terrain under overcast skies, the specific resonance characteristics of the natural materials available for instrument making, the specific relationship between spoken Irish language, with its particular phonemic structure, and the melodic patterns that emerged from that language, all of these factors have been shaping Irish musical expression for a very long time, and the human auditory system is not entirely separate from the genetics. Variants in genes involved in auditory processing, in fine pitch discrimination, in temporal resolution of sound, do differ between populations. Whether the Irish show specific auditory processing characteristics consistent with their musical tradition is not something that has been studied in the necessary way, but the question is legitimate. The point is not to claim that Irish music or Irish art or Irish language is better than other music or art or language. The point is that they are specifically Irish in ways that have depth, historical depth, and possibly biological depth, that connect to the genetic history of the population that produced them. The Irish are not simply a group of people who happen to live on a specific island. They are the product of that island, shaped by it over 12,000 years, and their cultural production, including their art and music and language and mythology, reflects that shaping in ways that go beyond what any purely cultural account can fully explain. The face is the most visible evidence of this, but the face is not the only evidence. Everything about the culture, its relationship to landscape, its relationship to the past, its specific aesthetic preferences, its specific musical and verbal traditions, is consistent with the story told by the genetics. A story about a population that is genuinely old in a genuinely specific way, shaped by a genuinely specific geography, and still carrying, in its faces and its culture and its genes, the record of everything that made it what it is. That is the real reason. Comprehensive, layered, documented at the level of ancient DNA and blood group frequencies and skull, morphology and cultural archaeology and comparative linguistics. Not a simple answer, because simple answers to complex questions are usually wrong, but a true answer, as complete as the current state of knowledge allows. The Irish look different because of where they are and because of what that place has done to them over 12,000 years. Because the island filtered the migrations that hit every other European population and kept the ancient signal alive. Because the Atlantic ecology was specific enough that the ancient adaptations remained relevant rather than being replaced. Because the sea channel was wide enough to slow but not stop gene flow, creating the conditions for gradual absorption rather than rapid replacement. Because Rome never came. And because, perhaps most importantly, the people stayed. Generation after generation, the people stayed on that island at the edge of the world, working the same landscape their ancestors had worked, telling stories about the same hills and rivers and bogs their ancestors had told stories about, looking out at the same water, and the staying accumulated, year by year, generation by generation, into a genetic heritage that is unlike any other in Western Europe. The face is the evidence. The face is the archive. The face is the 12,000-year record, written in genetics, of everything that happened to produce it. Look at it once more, and now you will see it differently than you did before. Not just a face, a document, a record, a story, written before writing existed, carried forward by the people who have been its guardians since the island was first walked, still readable today by those who know the language of genetics and ancient DNA and the specific history of a specific island at the specific edge of the specific world that made it what it is. That is the real reason the Irish look different from every other European. The full answer, the true answer, written in the bones and the blood and the genes of a people who stayed at the edge of the world, and let the world, over 12,000 years, make them what they are. There is a final dimension to the story of Irish genetic distinctiveness that deserves careful treatment. The dimension of what it means to study a living population's genetics, to analyze the physical characteristics and the ancestral components of people who are alive today and who have their own relationship to their identity and their history. Science does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a world where the information it produces has consequences for real people, and the Irish are real people with a real and sometimes painful relationship to questions of identity and belonging and who they are supposed to be. The Irish experience of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the famine, the suppression of the language, the colonial relationship, the massive emigration, created a specific kind of relationship to questions of identity. A defensive relationship, sometimes, an intensely invested one. The question of what it means to be Irish, who counts as Irish, whether Irishness is an ethnic category or a cultural one or a political one, has been contested in Ireland and in the diaspora for generations. People have died over these questions in the most literal sense. The genetics does not resolve these questions, it complicates them in interesting ways. What the ancient DNA evidence shows is that the Irish population is not, and has never been, racially pure in any meaningful sense. It is a mixture, a specific mixture, with a specific character that distinguishes it from other European populations, but a mixture nonetheless. The Mesolithic hunters mixed with Neolithic farmers, the farmers mixed with Bronze Age steppe people. The steppe admixed Irish mixed with Iron Age newcomers, the historical Irish mixed with Norse and Norman and English and Scots. Every generation added something to the mixture. The mixture has a character. The character is real, the WHG baseline is real, but it is not a purity. It is a specific kind of complexity that produces a coherent result. And that coherent result, the Irish genetic profile, is more accurately described as old than as pure, and more accurately described as specific than as isolated. This matters for how people think about Irish identity. If Irish distinctiveness is about purity, about descent from a single uninterrupted lineage going back to some original Irish people, then it is a fragile and contestable thing, because the genetics shows it is not pure. But if Irish distinctiveness is about character, about the specific result produced by a specific history of mixing in a specific place, then it is robust. It is real, whether or not any individual Irish person is descended from only Irish ancestors. The character of the mixture is what it is, regardless of how many individual lines of descent contributed to it. The diaspora Irish, the people of Irish descent who live in America and Australia and Britain and Argentina and wherever else the emigration scattered them, have their own complex relationship to Irish identity. Many of them have non-Irish ancestry from subsequent generations of mixing in their countries of settlement. They are not genetically Irish in the same way that a person born and raised in County Clare is genetically Irish. But many of them carry Irish genetic characteristics in visible form, the red hair, the pale skin, the eyes, that are read as Irish even in contexts far from Ireland. The genetics has dispersed, but has not disappeared. What Irish identity means in the diaspora is a cultural and political question more than a genetic one, but the genetics is part of it. The physical characteristics that persist in diaspora populations, that appear in unexpected faces, generations removed from the island, are evidence that something real was carried out of Ireland with the emigrants. Something biological, not just cultural. And the biological something connects back, through however many generations, to the island and the specific history and the 12,000 years of staying that produced the specifically Irish genetic profile. For the diaspora Irish, the genetics provides a kind of bridge between lived identity and physical evidence. The person in Boston who identifies as Irish but has never been to Ireland, who looks Irish in ways that people notice without knowing why they notice, who carries in their face characteristics that reflect a 12,000-year history of Atlantic island life, has a legitimate claim on that identity that goes beyond cultural performance. The genetics is there. The ancestry is real. The connection to the island and its specific history is written in the DNA, however many generations removed. This does not resolve the question of what Irish identity means. That is a question that belongs to the people who claim it, not to the science that describes its biological substrate. But the science confirms that there is a biological substrate, that it is real and specific and documented, and that it connects every person who carries it to the same ancient story of an island and a population, and 12,000 years of the most interesting kind of persistence. Now let us return to the beginning, to the face itself, and to the question of why it provokes a response in people who encounter it. The response is not universal. Not every person finds the Irish face immediately legible as specifically Irish, but the response is common enough to be worth examining. Something in the specific combination of characteristics that defines the Irish face, the pale skin and the light eyes, and the dark or auburn hair, and the particular bone structure, reads as old to the human visual system in a way that most contemporary European faces do not. This might be because most contemporary European faces are themselves the product of several thousand years of continental admixture that averaged out the original variations into something more uniform. The WHG face, diluted by Anatolian farmer and steppe ancestry in various proportions, became somewhat homogenized across the continent. The remaining variation is real, but more subtle than the variation you see when you encounter a face where the WHG component is running at a significantly higher proportion than the continental average. The Irish face is distinctive in part because it is at an extreme end of the distribution. It is not average European. It is specifically WHG heavy in ways that create a combination of characteristics that does not frequently appear in populations further east or further south. When someone who has grown up surrounded by continental European average faces encounters an Irish face, the combination of characteristics registers as unusual, as somehow outside the familiar range of variation. The conscious mind may not be able to articulate why, but the visual system, which is extraordinarily good at detecting face-space novelty, notices. And then there is the specific quality of the skin. Pale skin in itself is not unusual in Northern Europe, but the Irish complexion is not simply pale. It is pale in a specific way that reflects the specific genetics of skin pigmentation in a population where the WHG baseline was high and where the skin lightening mutations had to act on that specific baseline. The result is a skin that is not just pale but translucent in a way that shows the vascular structure beneath it clearly, that blushes readily, that responds to cold and to emotion and to sunlight with visible, immediate color changes. This translucency is itself a consequence of the genetics. The WHG skin, darker than modern European skin to begin with, was lightened by mutations in SLC2, 4, A5, and related genes that increased the translucency of the skin while reducing its overall melanin content. On a WHG genetic background, with the specific variants associated with that ancestry, the result is a skin quality that differs subtly from the skin produced by the same skin-lightening mutations on a more Anatolian farmer-heavy background. Whether this explains the specific quality of Irish complexion that painters and writers have noted for centuries, the translucency, the way light moves through it rather than reflecting from it, is uncertain. But the genetics is consistent with a physical substrate behind the observation. The Irish skin is not just less pigmented than other European skins, it is differently structured, differently constituted, reflecting the specific genetic history that produced it. The eyes are perhaps the most immediately striking characteristic. The frequency of light, eyes, blue and green and grey, and the indeterminate shades that fall between, is extremely high in Ireland. And the specific quality of Irish eye colour, the way it shifts and changes with the light, the way blue eyes in the Irish face are often a specific shade that contains elements of grey or green or silver that make them difficult to categorise, reflects the genetic complexity of eye colour genetics in a WHG-heavy population. Eye colour is not a simple trait controlled by one or two genes. It is a complex trait with contributions from dozens of genes that interact in non-linear ways to produce the final result. In populations with high WHG ancestry, where the frequencies of multiple eye color-associated variants are skewed toward the light end of the spectrum, the result is not just lighter eyes on average, but a greater diversity of light eye shades, because more individuals are carrying combinations of variants that produce unusual intermediate results. The Irish eye is not just blue or green. It is a specific shade of blue or green or grey that is the product of a specific genetic background, and that specific shade is part of what makes the Irish face recognizable. All of these characteristics, the skin, the eyes, the hair, the bone structure, they hang together as a package because they are genetically connected. They are not independent traits that happen to cluster together by chance. They are traits that evolved together, or that were swept together by the same demographic events in a population that spent tens of thousands of years in a specific environment that favored them. And they are expressed together in Irish faces because that population's genetic legacy is still running at high frequency in the Irish genome. The package is ancient, the island preserved it, and the science, finally, has given it a language precise enough to explain what was always visible to anyone who looked closely enough at the face. The end of this story is the beginning of the next. The science is still running. The ancient DNA databases are still growing. The populations are still being studied. The questions that this script has tried to answer are being refined by researchers in universities in Dublin and Oxford and Copenhagen and Harvard, in laboratories where ancient bones yield their genetic secrets to techniques that did not exist 15 years ago. What those researchers will find, as they add resolution to the picture, will not contradict the story told here. The foundations are too solid for the overall architecture to change, but they will fill in details, add nuance, identify specific processes and specific events that cannot currently be pinned down precisely. The history of the Irish genome will become more detailed, more precise, more complete, and at the end of all that precision and completeness, the Irish face will still be there, still old, still specific, still carrying the Atlantic in its pigmentation and its bone structure and its 12,000-year genetic record, still looking west at the water that has always been there. That was there when the first people arrived, and that will be there long after the last people who know the story of why the face is what it is have themselves become part of the record. The water does not forget. The island does not forget. The genetics does not forget. And now, neither do you. That is the story of the real reason the Irish look different from every other European. As old as the island, as specific as the Atlantic, and as real as the faces that are still carrying it forward, generation by generation, into whatever future the western shore of the world is building toward. Look at it, remember it, and the next time you see that face, in Ireland or in the diaspora or in a city on the far side of the world where the emigrants took it, you will know what you are looking at. The end of a very long journey from the Iberian shore to the western island, 12,000 years of staying, encoded in skin and eyes and hair and bone, still here, still legible, still extraordinary. The real reason, the full story, the ancient truth written in the faces of the living, waiting for the science to catch up with what the genetics knew all along. There is one last thread worth pulling before this story fully closes. The thread that connects the Irish case to the broader question of what ancient genetic distinctiveness means for how we understand human history and human diversity. For most of the 20th century, the dominant model of European prehistory was built on a limited and incomplete evidence base. The physical anthropologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries, working with skeletal measurements and blood group data and limited archaeological evidence, built models that were simultaneously remarkably prescient in some respects and badly wrong in others. Prescient in recognizing that there were meaningful differences between European populations and that those differences had historical explanations. Badly wrong in the hierarchical frameworks they used to interpret those differences, and in the purity-based models they imposed on what was actually a complex history of mixture and change. The ancient DNA revolution, which began in earnest around 2010 and has accelerated dramatically since then, has provided a tool for testing those old models against real genetic data. The results have been consistently more complex and more interesting than any of the old models predicted. Populations that were thought to be ancient and unchanged turn out to have been substantially replaced relatively recently. Populations that were thought to be recent arrivals turn out to have deep roots. The mixing that created modern European populations was more extensive, more repeated, and more complex than anyone had imagined. Within that broader picture of complexity, the Irish case stands out as genuinely unusual, not uniquely unusual. The Basques are similarly distinctive, similarly old in a specific way, similarly preserving a pre-agricultural genetic signal at high frequency. The Sardinians are another case, a Mediterranean island population that also retained unusually high early European farmer ancestry because of island isolation. But the Irish case is distinctive in the specific character of what was preserved, the WHG ancestry, and in the specific circumstances that preserved it, the Atlantic island position, the wet ecology, the absence of Roman colonization, the sea channel filter. Understanding the Irish case is not just about understanding Ireland, it is about understanding what European prehistory actually looked like before the successive waves of migration and admixture that produced the modern European genetic landscape. The Irish genome is a window into a world that existed before agriculture, before the steppe migrations, before the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and the historical period. A world of Atlantic maritime hunter-gatherers adapted to a specific coastal environment, carrying a specific genetic profile, living a specific kind of life on the edge of the ocean. That world is mostly invisible to us now. It is buried under the successive layers of later populations and later cultures. The sites where its people lived are underwater, flooded by the rising seas of the post-glacial period. The languages they spoke are lost. The specific knowledge they carried about the Atlantic world, its currents and its fish and its weather patterns and its seasonal changes, is mostly gone, preserved at most in fragments of later oral tradition. But their genetics is still here, preserved most completely in the people of Ireland, visible in the faces of a population that, through the specific accidents of geography and history, managed to hold on to more of the ancient Atlantic baseline than any other population in the world. That is the gift and the burden and the extraordinary fact of Irish genetic distinctiveness. The gift is that it tells us, in a language that ancient DNA can now read, something about what Western Europe looked like before any of the historical processes that shaped it. The burden is that it comes packaged with a physical distinctiveness that has been weaponized against the people who carry it. The extraordinary fact is that it persisted at all, that the filters and the sea channel and the wet ecology and the absence of Rome somehow combined to preserve, in this one island at the edge of the world, a genetic signal that should by rights have been diluted into invisibility long ago. It was not diluted into invisibility. It is still there, still in the faces, still in the blood type frequencies, still in the ancient DNA sequenced from the bones of people who lived on that island across the millennia, still legible to the science that now has the tools to read it. The island kept its secret, the DNA finally told it, and the secret turned out to be, as the best secrets usually are, both simpler and stranger than anyone had imagined. Simpler because the explanation is, at its core, just geography and demography and genetics interacting over time. Stranger because the timescales involved, the 12,000 years of island history, the 40,000 years of WHG ancestry, the 100,000 years of Atlantic coastal population evolution, going back into the Iberian refugium and beyond, make the story larger than any national history can fully contain. The Irish face is the face of deep time, the face of the Atlantic world before history, the face of a genetic heritage that went to the edge of the world and stayed there and became, through the staying, something specific and old and still visible in the people who are its inheritors. Now you know the story, the whole of it, or as much of the whole as current science allows. The genetics and the archaeology and the mythology and the history, all telling the same story from different angles, all pointing to the same conclusion, that the face is old, that the oldness is real, that it is written in every cell of the bodies of the people who carry it, and that the reason they carry it, the specific reason, the one that distinguishes Ireland from every other place in Western Europe, is the island, the Atlantic. The particular position of a particular piece of rock at the particular edge of a particular world, 12,000 years of human occupation, and the accumulated consequence of all of it, still visible, still real, still extraordinary in every face that carries it forward into whatever comes next. That is the real reason the Irish look different, and now it is yours. There is a particular hour in the west of Ireland, an hour that comes in the late afternoon when the sun is low and the Atlantic light is doing what Atlantic light does at that angle. Everything goes golden and grey simultaneously. The bog turns amber. The stone walls that crisscross the landscape catch the light on their western faces and go warm. The water, the lakes, and the sea, visible from the higher ground, becomes a mirror for a sky that is doing something extraordinary with the clouds coming in from the southwest. In that light, if you stand in the right place, which is to say almost anywhere in Connaught or West Munster or Donegal, the landscape stops being a contemporary landscape and starts being something else. It starts being a landscape that could be from any point in the last 12,000 years. The bog was there, the stone was there. The light was doing this same thing in this same place when the first people walked north from the coast and found that this island was going to be their home. The people who stand in that landscape today and watch the light do what it does are the same people, not the same individuals, but the same genetic lineage, modified and mixed across 120 centuries, carrying in their cells the record of all the modifications and all the mixings and still, underneath it all, carrying the ancient Atlantic baseline that makes them specifically Irish rather than specifically anything else. The light touches their faces, the same light that has always been there. And their faces, pale and specific, and old in the specific way that genetics preserves old things, reflect it back at the world, as they have always done, as they will continue to do. That is what you are really looking at when you see an Irish face. The light of the Atlantic, reflected through 12,000 years of the most specific kind of human persistence back into the world that shaped it. You needed to know that. Now you do. The science will keep advancing. The picture will keep getting sharper. But the story it tells will not change in its essentials. The Irish genome is old and specific and real. The face is its most visible expression, and now you know why. The ancient Atlantic shore, preserved in the faces of the living, is the most remarkable story that genetics has yet given us. The island kept it safe for 12,000 years. The science finally read it. And you, in knowing it now, are part of the continuation of a story that began long before history and that shows no sign of ending. The face that looks old, because it is old. The face that carries the Atlantic inside it, still here, still real. It is the oldest face in the Western world. And it knows it,